Meredith Lane pulled the knife from her husband's hand before 40 guests could finish cheering. The blade was silver, engraved with an interlocking K, and 3 generations of Kesslers had cut their wedding cakes with it. It struck the walnut table and stood there, quivering, humming one long note into a room where nobody was breathing anymore. 40 raised phones stayed raised. The white tear leaned, slowly, almost politely, and went down into the linen, and 40 people stood rooted, staring at the maid August Kessler had married 4 hours ago, at her hand still closed around the handle, white to every knuckle. She had smelled it 2 seconds before her hand moved. Almonds, thin as a thread, faintly sweet, running underneath the buttercream and the vanilla. That morning, she had stood in the white-tiled kitchen and watched them make that cake. From the first egg to the last stroke of the palette knife, there were no almonds in the recipe. She was a bartender's daughter. From the age of 6, her father had made her stand behind the counter, close her eyes, and breathe. He taught her that liquor never lies, only people know how to put something else into it. He died in prison, carrying a confession he would never speak aloud, and the nose he had trained in his daughter was still there, still working, in a room full of silk and silver and smiling mouths, 6 weeks at Ashgrove Hill. Married 4 hours, if she was wrong, she was a madwoman who had just destroyed her own wedding in front of 40 cameras. If she was right, then someone in this bright room had planned to bury that man before Thanksgiving. And that someone had already written her name in the empty space. Being right was far worse. No one spoke. Then, from the far end of the table, a woman's voice rose from behind a folded fan, not quite soft enough to be a whisper. The girl's out of her mind. August Kessler stood at the head of his own wedding table, 34 years old and already gray at the temples. Thin as a lath beneath a Milan-cut suit he would not let anyone take in. The whole room was looking at the fallen cake. He was looking at his wife. His cousin came around the table, warm and solicitous as ever, and reached for his elbow. "Sit down, August. The shock, you'll forgive my wife." August's voice was very quiet, and it reached the back wall without effort. She buried her father last year and gained a husband this morning. The cake was not to her taste. He turned to the housekeeper. "Bring another." Nobody laughed. That night, all along the lakeshore, they were saying that the new Kessler bride had driven a knife into the table at her own wedding. The next morning, on the lid of the trash bin behind the kitchen, where the cake had been thrown away, 9 honeybees lay stiff, legs curled, wings spread. It occurred to no one to look. She looked. She counted 9, folded them into a paper napkin, and laid them at the bottom of her suitcase beside her father's leather notebook, the only thing he left her, and a tin box that in 6 weeks in that house she had never once opened in front of anyone. If Meredith's story touched something in you, leave a like, share it with someone you think needs to hear it, and subscribe to our channel, because there are still many lives waiting to be told. They led her to a room in the East Wing, on the 2nd floor, at the end of a corridor carpeted so thickly that no one's footsteps could be heard. The butler, a man named Gates, walked ahead of her with a key in his hand, and he didn't look at her even once. At the door he stopped, cleared his throat, and said that this was for your comfort, Mom. And the way he said the word comfort told Meredith that he had been rehearsing it in his mind for the entire length of the corridor. The door closed. The key turned once in the lock. Outside, the footsteps receded, then vanished completely into the carpet. She stood in the middle of a room where she had never spent a single night, because for the past 6 weeks she had slept in the basement with the other servants, and she looked at the wedding silk hanging from its hook like a flayed corpse. She didn't take it off. She sat on the edge of the bed, placed both hands on her knees, and waited. The woman came shortly before 9 o'clock the next morning, carrying the tray herself. Cordelia Breese was 63 years old, nearly as tall as a man, with thick sun-browned forearms shaped by 30 years of washing, carrying, and pulling open heavy doors. She set the tray on the table without haste, then straightened and looked Meredith over, from the shoes that had been resoled twice to the hair tied low at the nape of her neck. She looked carefully. She looked the way a woman looks when she has spent her entire life learning who is inside a great house. "I'm Cordelia Breese. I run this house." I held him in my arms before I was in charge of anything at all. Meredith didn't rise. She thought that standing now would look too much like an apology. "You won't receive any cruelty from me," the woman said. "And you won't receive any welcome either, not until I know what you are." Downstairs, They say you married him so you could sit and wait for him to die. They say you couldn't even wait until the celebration was over. If I wanted him dead, Mom, Meredith said, all I had to do was stand still. The air in the room stopped. Far below, a door closed, and someone dragged a chair across a stone floor. Cordelia Bryce didn't blink. She remained still for long enough that another person would have felt compelled to say more, to explain, to soften what had just been said. Meredith said nothing. Eat all of it, she said at last. No one can eat eggs once they're cold. Then she left. Meredith sat and listened. The woman took 3 steps down the corridor. She stopped. There was the faintest sound of metal touching metal inside the pocket of her apron. Then she continued on. Meredith remained seated for another minute, then rose, crossed to the door, and placed her hand on the knob. It turned. It turned easily and smoothly, like every knob in this house, and the door opened a crack, letting a blade of light fall into the empty corridor. Cordelia hadn't turned the key. Meredith closed the door again, very gently. She stood there for a moment with her hand still resting against the wood. In the language of women who kept houses, an unlocked door was an entire letter, and she had understood every word of it. She finished the plate of eggs. She washed her hands. Then she pulled the suitcase from beneath the bed and opened it. 9 bees lay inside the layers of tissue paper, exactly where she had placed them the night before, their legs curled inward, their wings spread like 2 slivers of delicate scale. Beside them lay a leather-bound notebook, its 4 corners worn white, and at the very bottom, beneath the folded clothes, was the tin box. She placed her palm on its lid. The metal was cold, with a dent in the left corner from the time it had fallen onto the kitchen floor of the apartment in Cleveland, and she had sat among the scattered papers for 40 minutes. She didn't open it. She folded the clothes back into place, closed the suitcase, pushed it beneath the bed, and walked to the window. Below lay the rear courtyard of Ash Grove Hill. Rows of stone walls, a covered porch, and beyond them, the flat surface of Lake Michigan beneath a September sky. People were cleaning up. 4 men carried stacks of folding chairs out of the great hall, and Meredith stood watching them, and she began to count. She counted 40 chairs. She knew the great hall of this house could hold 300 seats, because during her first week she had scrubbed its floor on both knees, and she knew exactly how many footsteps long it was. She also knew that the head cook had ordered flowers for 120 guests at the beginning of August, then canceled them, then reordered for 80, then canceled again. And she remembered something she hadn't thought about until that morning. For the 2 weeks before the wedding, every evening, Gates had carried a list upstairs to the study on the 3rd floor. Every morning, he had brought it back down, and each time, it had grown shorter. She had been standing there polishing the stair rail and had seen it 3 times. Names crossed out in black ink, each one struck through once, decisively, without hesitation. He had crossed them out with his own hand. Every night, more names disappeared. Not one person in that house had asked why. 6 weeks earlier, in a cafe on Detroit Avenue in Cleveland, a man in a gray suit had pulled out a chair for her and called her by name before she had the chance to tell him what it was. He ordered a cup of black coffee for himself and a cup of warm milk for her, because, he said, he guessed she had been on her feet since 5 o'clock that morning and coffee would only make her stomach hurt more. He was right. Meredith had been standing since 5 o'clock at the Rothmore Hotel, where she cleaned 32 rooms a day, the same hotel where her father had stood behind the bar for 30 years. And she had taken the job because it was the only place left in the city willing to hire her after his name appeared in the newspapers. The man placed both hands on the table. He wore no ring. His fingernails were neatly trimmed. Then he said, "I'm Preston Kessler Hale, and I'm very sorry about your father." He said it in the way people do when they truly are sorry, slowly, without looking away, without moving at once to some other subject. And Meredith had lived long enough to know that this was the hardest manner of all to imitate. Then he asked about Ruthie. He asked how old the little girl was now, and he spoke her name gently, familiarly, like an uncle who had last seen the child at some long-ago Christmas. Meredith set down her cup of milk. She hadn't spoken her daughter's name to anyone in that city for 15 months. He took a thick 4-page document from his briefcase and slid it across the table. He said, "My nephew is dying." He said, "My nephew's name is August Kessler. He's 34 years old, and the doctors call it a physical decline of unknown cause. And everyone along the lakeshore calls it the Kessler family curse, and the name doesn't change the outcome," he said. My nephew needs a wife. Not a nurse, not a relative, but a stranger, because a stranger who mourns loses nothing. And August doesn't want anyone weeping sincerely beside his grave. He said. He has agreed. He simply doesn't know who she is yet. There were 4 provisions, printed in bold, numbered from 1 through 4, and Meredith read them while the milk beneath her hand slowly went cold. 1. Enter into a lawful marriage with August Kessler at the Cook County Courthouse. 2. Reside full-time at Ashgrove Hill, and care for him in the home until his death. 3. Do not leave the grounds for more than 24 hours without written permission. 4. Upon completion of the contract, all legal debt held in the name of Wendell Lane would be paid in full, and Party B would receive a widow's allowance paid monthly for the remainder of her life. Preston Kessler Hale said nothing while she read. He stirred his coffee exactly twice and set the spoon down on the saucer without making a sound. He told her she had 36 hours. He said, I'll be sitting here, at this same table, on Thursday morning, and if you don't come, I'll understand, and you'll never hear my name again. Then he stood, left the papers behind, and walked toward the door. At the door he turned back and added one more sentence. And it was the only sentence he spoke that morning in which his voice changed. He said, I hope you read all the way to the end of the last page, Miss Lane. She read all the way to the end of the last page. At the bottom, beneath the typed signature, beneath even the line concerning jurisdiction, there was a clause printed in smaller type than everything else, so small that she had to tilt the page toward the window. Section 7.4. Upon completion of the contract, Party A shall pay all legal expenses associated with Party B's appeal for custodial rights. She read it once and didn't understand. She read it a second time and understood, and she lowered the page to the table and looked out the window, where a bus was stopping and a young woman was lifting a baby onto the first step. She read it a third time, 36 hours, and she didn't need the 6 minutes. From the second reading, she had understood that the man in the gray suit hadn't come looking for a caregiver. She simply didn't understand why he had found exactly her. On Thursday morning, she arrived 40 minutes early and sat at that same table. He handed her his pen, a heavy fountain pen, and she signed her name beneath the 4 pages in the tiny, grain-like handwriting her father had taught her. Then he placed the document inside his briefcase, shook her hand, and thanked her. And before she could rise, he added, in a voice so natural it sounded almost incidental, that there would be a great deal to do on the morning of the wedding, and perhaps she could go down to the kitchen and wipe out his nephew's medicine box for him, because people so often forgot the little things. By the 3rd day after the wedding, no one had told Meredith that she was allowed to move freely through the house, and no one had told her that she wasn't. So at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, she went down to the kitchen, brewed a pot of tea, placed it on a silver tray, and carried it up to the study on the 3rd floor. The head cook watched her go and said nothing. Gates stood at the foot of the stairs, and he said nothing either, but he turned aside to let her pass, and in this house that was an answer. The study door stood slightly ajar. She knocked twice, and August Kessler's voice from within said, "Come in," calmly, as though he had been waiting for a cup of tea since morning. She pushed the door open with her elbow, stepped inside, and stopped. A man was kneeling on the rug in the middle of the room. He was about 50, wearing a canvas jacket still coated with dust from the docks, his hands clasped together before his chest, and he was trembling. No one was holding him. There was no one else in the room except August, seated behind the writing desk with one hand supporting his chin. The afternoon light streamed through the tall window behind him and reduced his entire body to a thin black shadow. There was nothing on the desk except a green glass lamp and a checkbook. Meredith stood in the doorway with the tray in her hands. No one told her to leave. August didn't look at her. He looked at the man on his knees and asked, in the voice someone might use to ask the time, "How much did you take from me?" The man began speaking very quickly, saying that he had worked at dock number 7 for 19 years, that his wife needed surgery, that he had only meant to borrow the money and would repay every cent, that his daughter. August allowed him to finish. He didn't interrupt once. When the man ran out of breath and fell silent, August spoke again in that same voice, not half a note higher, not half a note lower. "I didn't ask why. I asked how much." The man said 40,000. He forced the words out as though vomiting up something that had lain in his stomach for far too long. August drew the checkbook closer. He uncapped his pen. The nib touched the paper, And in that room, in the middle of a September afternoon, the sound of the pen moving across the page was the only sound there was. He wrote slowly. He wrote like a man who had all the time in the world, although he was the one person in that house who had the least. Then he tore the check along the perforated edge, pushed it across the desk, and released it. 80,000. Twice the amount. Take it, the man didn't dare touch it. He stared at the piece of paper lying on the wood, and his face went pale in the way a person's face pales when he realizes that what is happening isn't the thing he had prepared himself to endure. Take it, August said, and be out of Illinois before 6 o'clock this evening. He leaned back in his chair, fastened one button of his coat, and delivered the rest even more slowly. If I hear your name in this state one more time, I won't remember that I gave you money. And neither will my men. The man took the check. He rose, but his knees failed him, and for 1 second he had to brace himself against the edge of the desk. He walked toward the door. He passed so close to Meredith that she could smell machine oil and dried sweat on the collar of his jacket. And he was crying in silence, his mouth pressed tightly shut, tears running down both sides of his nose, and he didn't wipe them away. He disappeared down the stairs. Then the front door on the ground floor closed, far away and very softly. In the study, August Kessler capped his pen and placed it neatly beside the checkbook, parallel to the edge of the desk. He still hadn't looked at her. You may set the tray down, Miss Lane. The tea is getting cold. Meredith stepped forward. She placed the tray on the corner of the desk, turned the handle of the teapot toward his right hand, and poured. The tea flowed in a steady stream, unbroken and true, without a single drop spilling over the rim of the cup. She set the pot down. She stepped back half a pace and folded her hands before her waist, just as she had been taught at the Rothmore Hotel. Only then did August Kessler look at her. He looked down at her hands. He looked for a long time, longer than he had looked at the man kneeling on the rug, and something shifted in his eyes very slightly, like a door opening another fraction of an inch in a dark corridor. Your hands don't shake, he said. Meredith said, I've been pouring tea for 13 years, sir. He lifted the cup. He didn't drink. He merely held it between both hands, while the steam rose through fingers so thin that the light almost seemed able to pass through them. In that room, a man had just been bought and sold out of an entire state in exactly 45 seconds, with a single piece of paper. No raised voice, no lifted hand, standing there with her hands folded before her. She thought that she had spent 6 weeks in this house, scrubbing floors, folding towels, and never looking at anyone for longer than 3 seconds. And she had believed she was living beneath the roof of a dying man. She had been wrong. She was living beneath the roof of a dying man, and that man was still ruling everything within his sight from behind a writing desk, and death hadn't taken even 1% of that power from him. Then she thought something else, and this thought came more slowly, more coldly. Someone in this house had dared to put almonds in that man's wedding cake. Someone had dared, and the tea was still steaming in his hands. He came on the 4th day, at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and he came alone. Gates wasn't walking ahead of him with a key. No one was supporting him by the elbow. Meredith heard footsteps in the thickly carpeted corridor, and she heard them because they weren't even, because after every 7 or 8 steps there was a brief pause, no longer than a single breath, and then they continued. She rose from the edge of the bed. Later, when she had learned the price of everything in that house, she would understand that the 32 stairs from the 3rd floor down to the east wing were an expense, and that he had paid it in cash, borrowing from no one. He knocked. That was the first thing that startled her, that the man who owned the floor beneath her feet would knock on the door. She opened it. He stood there in the gray coat whose shoulders had quietly grown too broad for him, and he asked whether she would mind if he sat down, and she pointed to the armchair beside the window, and he sat there rather than anywhere else, and he kept his back straight. My uncle wants me to have the marriage annulled, he said without preamble. He already has a doctor's opinion in his hand saying that you are mentally unstable, and a lawyer's opinion saying that grounds can be found. They're waiting for me to sign the papers, and instead of signing them, you came here, Meredith said, and instead of signing them, I came here. He looked at her for 1 heartbeat longer than politeness allowed. Why did you marry me, Miss Lane? I was told that you had agreed, that word. Ever since Saturday, I've been sitting there wondering what they used it to cover. She stood beside the window with her hands hanging at her sides, and she said, You know exactly what it was covering, sir, so I won't waste your time describing it to you. What I need to tell you is something else. He waited. He didn't hurry her. That refusal to hurry was the hardest thing in the world to endure. On Saturday morning, I stood in the kitchen for 2 hours and watched them make that cake, she said. Butter, sugar, vanilla, lemon peel, heavy cream. There were no almonds. There wasn't a single almond anywhere in that kitchen. By the afternoon, when they carried it upstairs and you took the knife, I smelled almonds, not flavoring, not the smell of cake, something thin and sweet underneath it, rising through the cream about half a second later. August didn't move. The next morning, I went behind the kitchen, she continued, to the place where they had thrown the cake away. There were 9 honeybees on the lid of the trash bin. Every one of them was dead. Not one had managed to fly away. I wrapped them up, and I still have them, and if you want to see them, they're in the suitcase beneath that bed. A branch brushed against the window pane. Then she said the last part, and she said it slowly, because she knew she would only be allowed to say it once. You aren't cursed, sir. You're being poisoned. On Saturday, someone put something into a cake, from which only 2 people in the room were supposed to eat the first slice. And I think there has been something else before that, something slower, something that has lasted much longer. There is no need to finish off a man who's already wasting away. Someone has grown impatient with you. For 3 seconds, she believed he had heard her. Then he spoke, and his voice was very gentle, and that gentleness was the cruelest part. My father died from this exact thing, Miss Lane. The same cough, the same coat growing looser every month until his tailor no longer dared look him in the eye. He was 43. I stood beside his bed and I was 14 years old, and I counted every breath he took. People called it the Kessler family curse. My doctor calls it a physical decline. He paused and he breathed, and he waited until the breath had returned to its proper place. I have spent an entire year searching for another name for it. I paid 4 people in 4 cities to find that name. I couldn't find it, and neither will you. He rose from the chair. He did it in a single movement, and he paid for it, and he concealed the bill by straightening the shoulders of his coat. Pain always goes looking for an author, he said. I know. I searched for one all year. You have only been inside this house for 6 weeks, and this house is full of things that look like evidence. 9 dead bees on the lid of a trash bin in September, Miss Lane. Are 9 dead bees on the lid of a trash bin in September. Meredith didn't argue. She had grown up in a room behind a counter, and she knew that no one could sell medicine to a person who was shaking his head. She only watched him walk toward the door, and she watched him brace one hand against the door frame for exactly half a second, and she watched him lower it before he stepped out. Meredith remained in the room, one hand resting on the windowsill, and she thought that he had been right about one thing and wrong about another. He was right that she wouldn't find that name by asking him. And he was wrong, fatally wrong, to believe that those 9 bees were merely 9 bees. Because she had counted them, and in all her life she had never counted anything incorrectly. He had taken 3 steps into the corridor when she called him back, and she called in the ordinary voice of someone asking for an extra towel, not in the voice of someone who had just been dismissed. Sir? He stopped. He turned slowly, and in that moment she saw that he had already prepared himself to hear her argue, had already prepared another gentle answer, and she didn't let him use it. Because she had grown up in a room behind a counter, and she had known that rule before she knew how to read, that once a man had shaken his head, you didn't push the bottle toward him again. You put it away. You wiped the counter. You waited until he picked it up himself. I'd like to ask you for something, she said. Something small. He waited. At the foot of the east wing staircase, there is a door, she said. An oak door, locked with a brass lock, with a key as long as the palm of my hand. For 6 weeks I've cleaned that corridor twice a week, and I've never seen it opened. The head cook told me it was your mother's workroom, and that no one has crossed its threshold in 12 years. August said nothing. His silence had weight of its own, and Meredith stood still beneath it. I'm not asking you to believe me, she continued. You don't believe me, and you have every right not to, and I won't spend another afternoon trying to change your mind. I'm asking for the key. I grew up behind an apothecary counter, sir. I was taught to weigh, to strain, to smell, and apart from those things, I don't know how to do much of anything, right now. In this house, I have 2 hands and nothing to do with them, and empty hands give birth to all kinds of trouble. He was still looking at her. Let them talk, she said. Let them tell one another that the mad servant girl has gone down there to make rosewater. I'll make rosewater. I'll make soap and peppermint tea, and I'll label every jar. You won't have to hear another word from me about almonds. In the corridor, the afternoon light was withdrawing down the wall, slowly and evenly, and for a very long time neither of them moved. August Kessler looked at her the way a man looks at a pillar while deciding whether it can bear the weight of the roof. That gaze passed through her like a current of cold air slipping beneath the door of a stone cellar. Then he inclined his head once, very slightly. "The room is yours," he said. "Mrs. Bryce has the key." He turned. He took 2 steps. At the doorway, he stopped a second time, and this time he didn't turn fully around. He only angled his head back just enough for her to see one cheekbone, and a jaw so thin that the skin seemed drawn directly over the bone. "You will find," he said, "that this house is full of people deciding for me what I'm capable of enduring. Dr. Thorne weighs every word before he opens his mouth. Gates hides the newspapers if there is bad news about the docks. Mrs. Bryce tells me the weather is warm, and the weather isn't warm. My uncle tells me to sit down. 10 people, Miss Lane. I've counted them. I'm not asking much of you. I'm only asking you not to become the 11th. Meredith stood in the doorway of her room with her hands hanging at her sides, and she answered neither quickly nor slowly. "I grew up behind an counter. People came there to be told the truth, or to be told a lie. I was never very good at the second." He remained there for one more beat. Then he left, and she listened as his footsteps receded along the corridor. 7 or 8 steps, and then a pause. 7 or 8 steps, and then a pause, until the carpet swallowed them all. She closed the door. She sat on the edge of the bed in the darkness and didn't turn on the lamp. She thought about those 10 people, and she thought that the man had lived for 2 years in a house where everyone loved him and not one of them was willing to tell him a single truth. And she thought that if someone wanted to kill a man in the slowest way possible, that was exactly how it would be done. Then she thought about the room at the foot of the east wing staircase. She had told him she would make rosewater, and that hadn't been a lie, because she would. She would make rosewater, and she would label it, and she would leave the door open for anyone who wished to look inside. But she would also have a scale. She would have a funnel, a strainer, a stack of clean glass jars, and a door with a brass lock for which only 2 women in that house carried a key. And she would have somewhere to place 9 bees. She lay down without taking off her clothes, and she stared up at the dark ceiling, and the final thought that came to her before sleep wasn't about poison, nor was it about the man climbing 32 stairs in the darkness. It was about something he had said 3 days earlier, in front of 40 guests, when he should have let them drag her away. "You must forgive my wife." He hadn't believed a word she said, and still he had stood in front of her. She woke just before 9 o'clock, still fully dressed, and went downstairs because she was thirsty, but she didn't take the main staircase. Instead, she went around by way of the 2nd-floor corridor, where a row of arched openings led onto a wooden balcony overlooking the library. 6 weeks of cleaning had taught her that this was the darkest place in the house after 8 o'clock at night, because no lamps were ever lit there, because no one had any reason to stand there at all. She stopped. Below her, about 4 yards straight down, the library was illuminated. A standing lamp burned beside an armchair. The fire in the hearth had been allowed to sink low, and August Kessler sat in that chair with an open book lying face down across the armrest, the top button of his collar undone, his gray coat draped over the back of the chair like a shed skin. He was staring into the fire. Then the library door opened, and Gates entered first, carrying a small silver tray with a glass and a pitcher of water upon it. Dr. Wesley Thorne followed behind him. Meredith had seen him 3 times in 6 weeks, always from a distance, and he had left her with the same impression each time, that he was a 52-year-old man who was exceptionally skilled at taking up very little space. He set his leather case on the table, opened it, and withdrew a bottle of dark amber glass with a cork stopper and a handwritten label. Meredith didn't move. She stood in the darkness above, one hand resting on the balcony rail, and watched. Thorne poured. He used both hands, his left holding the neck of the bottle, his right supporting the base, and he counted the drops. She counted with him, 12 drops. Then he added water from the pitcher until the glass was half full, swirled it gently 3 times, and handed it to Gates rather than to August, and Gates carried the tray 3 steps and placed it on the small table beside the armchair. Neither of them touched the glass again. The entire ritual unfolded so smoothly that it couldn't have been new. It was something repeated so many times that no one involved had to think about it anymore. Dr. Thorne stepped back half a pace, folded his hands before his waist, and smiled. A smile of perfect humility, and he said, "Sir, I still can't entrust this to anyone else. I've tried 3 compounding pharmacies in Chicago, and not one of them can prepare the proportions correctly. I'd rather lose another 20 minutes every evening." August Kessler picked up the glass. He didn't look into it. He turned it once in his palm, the way a man turns a glass of wine, not because he needed to, but from habit, and then he drank. He finished it in 3 swallows without pausing, without grimacing, without setting it down midway. He placed the empty glass on the silver tray, rested his head against the back of the chair, and said, "Thank you, Wesley. Thank you." The man sitting beneath that lamp had just drunk his own death to the last drop like a gentleman, and he had thanked the man who poured it, and he had thanked him in the voice of someone who was sincerely grateful. On the balcony, Meredith Lane didn't breathe. Gates carried the tray away. Dr. Thorne closed his case, fastened the clasps, and followed. The library door shut, and the footsteps of the 2 men moved along the ground-floor corridor toward the grand staircase, and Meredith left the balcony and moved along the wall without a sound, down to the landing between the 2 floors, where there was a brass wall lamp and a velvet upholstered chair upon which no one had ever sat. She stopped there, pressed close to the shadow of the wall. Below, at the foot of the staircase, Cordelia Bryce stood waiting with the house key in her hand. Dr. Thorne descended the final step and stopped before her, and he lowered his voice. But this house was built of stone, with ceilings 4.5 meters high, and stone kept no one's secrets. "Mrs. Bryce," he said, "I want you to know in advance so that you can prepare the staff downstairs. I reviewed his readings again this afternoon, his weight, his pulse, even the cough. His condition is progressing into a more serious stage." Cordelia said nothing. She stood straight, both hands resting before her apron, and looked at him. "I'm very sorry," Thorne said. "I'm truly very sorry, but we must support him with everything we have at our disposal. Beginning tonight, I'll increase the dose." Mrs. Bryce inclined her head slightly and asked, "By how much, doctor?" And Dr. Wesley Thorne refastened the button of his coat and answered in the kindest voice a man could possess, beneath the brass lamp at the foot of the staircase, inside Ashgrove Hill on the 4th night after the wedding. Double. The next morning, Cordelia Bryce led her to the foot of the east wing staircase and inserted the brass key into the lock with the expression of a woman reopening a grave she had filled with her own hands. The lock gave 2 dry clicks before yielding. Inside was a narrow room with a low ceiling and a small window level with the ground in the rear courtyard, and enough light entered through it to reveal a layer of dust lying evenly over everything, like snow that had fallen 12 years ago and never melted. Along 2 walls stood rows of small wooden drawers, each bearing a paper label that had yellowed with age, and on every label was a line of slanted writing in purple ink, with delicate upstrokes and heavy downstrokes, written by a woman who was dead. Cordelia placed the key on the stone work table and said that no one had crossed that threshold since the lady of the house died. Then she told Meredith to do as she pleased. She walked out, and at the doorway she paused for 1 beat before adding that if Meredith needed hot water, she should pull the 2nd bell, not the 1st. Meredith remained there all morning. She cleaned. She pulled out every drawer, read every label, and returned each one to its proper place. She found a brass balance scale with its complete set of weights, a glass funnel, 2 stacks of stoppered jars, a porcelain mortar, and in the lowest drawer on the right, a bundle of unused white paper tied with hemp cord. She washed the scale. She dried it with the hem of her apron and placed it in the center of the stone table, precisely in the middle, perfectly balanced, and she stood looking at it for a long time. Then she went upstairs, took the leather-bound notebook from the bottom of her suitcase, carried it down, and placed it beside the scale. She didn't open the notebook. She opened the bundle of blank paper, and she began to write. She wrote the date. She wrote the time. She wrote in the tiny, grain-like handwriting her father had taught her, 1 event to each line, without adjectives, without speculation, without a single word describing anything she hadn't seen with her own eyes. 6:45 in the morning, the head cook heated milk. 7:10, Gates carried the breakfast tray to the 3rd floor, containing eggs, toast, and 1 glass of water. 7:38, Gates brought the tray down, the glass of water untouched. 8 o'clock, The master coughed 4 times on the staircase, with pauses of 13 seconds and 7 seconds between the fits. 9:15, Dr. Thorne arrived in his own automobile, carrying a brown leather case with brass clasps, and he didn't allow anyone else to carry it. 11 o'clock, the master ate in the library and finished 1/3 of his plate. 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the master's uncle arrived, remained for 40 minutes, brought a stack of documents, and left with the same stack. 4 o'clock, Gates replaced the water in the pitcher in the library. 9 o'clock in the evening, Dr. Thorne opened his case. 12 drops. She sat beneath that small window every evening and copied down everything, and by the 4th day she had 4 pages, and by the 7th, she understood that one thing repeated itself with such exactness that it couldn't be accidental. The amber bottle was never outside the leather case for more than 4 minutes, never passed through the hands of a second person, and was never touched by anyone in the house except the man who brought it there. She wrote that down too. Then she turned to a fresh page and wrote a single line at the top, and it was the only line in the bundle of paper shaped like a question. Who weighs the bottle? On Friday afternoon of that week, she carried tea to the 3rd floor and found the study door open. Inside, August Kessler was standing by the window with the telephone receiver held between his shoulder and his ear, and he motioned for her to enter. She set down the tray. He was speaking to a man named Delaney, a city councilman who had voted that morning to block the lease for dock number 7. And August never once mentioned dock number 7. He asked about the private school in Winnetka, where Delaney's daughter was in the 10th grade. I hear the tuition there has risen to $42,000 this year, Mr. Delaney, he said. And you still have the girl boarding there? He said. I know the chairman of that school's board. We used to fish together on Lake Geneva when we were young. He said nothing more. He stood perfectly still, his left hand in his pocket, looking out across the lake, and listened to the man at the other end of the line for so long that Meredith could hear the faint, tinny voice coming through the receiver. 3 minutes. Then August said, "In that case, we understand one another," and hung up and turned around. She was standing beside the tea tray with both hands folded before her waist. "You're trying to decide whether I'm a bad man," he said. "No, sir," Meredith replied. "I'm trying to decide how long it would take you to do exactly the same thing to me." There was 1 second of silence. Then August Kessler laughed. It was a real laugh, brief and sudden, rising from deep inside his chest, and Meredith realized that she had never heard it before, and that perhaps the house itself hadn't heard it in a very long time, because out in the corridor the sound of a broom stopped. The laughter turned into a coughing fit. He turned away, drew a white silk handkerchief from his breast pocket, and coughed into it 4 times. Then he folded the handkerchief, folding it carefully into quarters without looking at it, and returned it to his pocket. When he turned back toward her, he was still smiling. On Saturday morning, sunlight slipped through the small window at ground level and laid a long golden strip across the stone work table, and Meredith was weighing dried rose petals when the oak door opened another handspan and a blonde head appeared in the gap. "Are you a witch?" She set down the weight. The boy stood in the doorway, 11 years old, barefoot, his canvas trousers rolled to his knees, one knee scraped, both hands still stained with dark earth. She had seen him 3 times in the garden, always behind the gardener named Prue, always carrying something larger than he was. "No," Meredith said, "I weigh flowers." "Who are you?" "I'm Jonah," the boy said. "My father grows that hedge out there." He stepped all the way inside without waiting to be invited, stood in the middle of the room with both hands on his hips, and looked at the 2 rows of wooden drawers running along the walls from the floor almost to the ceiling. "The cook says this place is haunted. She says there's a lady standing in that corner." "The cook lies," Meredith said. "There's nothing down here but dust and wooden boxes. Can you read?" The boy turned around. He looked at her with the direct, merciless gaze of a child, measuring whether the adult before him was about to laugh at him. "I know my letters," he said. "I've learned them. They just don't stay still." Meredith walked to the row of drawers on the left. She pulled one open, poured a pinch of dried leaves into her palm, and held them out for him to smell. Then she placed one finger on the yellowed paper label. "What word is this?" The boy tilted his head. He frowned. He sounded it out very slowly, 1 letter at a time, and said, "Mint." "Peppermint," Meredith said. "There's another part after it." He argued that the next letters looked like mint, and Meredith said, "That's right." "Peppermint." The boy lifted the leaves to his nose and said, This smells like candy. He ran to the next drawer. He read herbal tea as herbal tree. She told him it was herbal tea. He read the next label as horseweed, and she told him it was plantain, and he said it sounded like the name of a horse, and he laughed. The sound struck the low ceiling, bounced down onto the stone work table, and made the glass jars still drying upside down on the cloth tremble slightly, and Meredith stood still for 1 second, because she suddenly realized that in the 6 weeks she had lived at Ashgrove Hill, she had never heard laughter inside the house. Not in the kitchen, not in the servants' rooms, not in the corridors. The house had 41 doors and 37 people moving through it every day, and not one of them laughed. The boy misread the 4th drawer, and the 5th and the 6th. He pronounced chamomile as camomile, and his face turned red with embarrassment, and Meredith said, "It's all right, that one is difficult. My father misread it all the time too." He looked up. "Did your father have boxes like these?" "My father had 300 of them," she said, "behind a counter as long as this room. He labeled everyone." He thought for a moment, then asked why, and she said, "So he would never make a mistake," and he nodded as though that were the most sensible answer in the world. Then he started again from the 1st drawer. He read an entire row, 19 labels, and he got 11 of them wrong, and every time he made a mistake, he burst out laughing at himself before she could correct him. At the final drawer, he turned around and said, "Can I come back down tomorrow?" Meredith said, "You may, if you wash your hands first." He held out both blackened hands and looked at them as though he had only just discovered they belonged to him, and he laughed again. Out in the corridor, behind the open door, Cordelia Bryce stood perfectly still. She had been standing there since the boy misread the word peppermint. She was holding a stack of clean towels, and she didn't step inside, and she didn't speak, and Meredith didn't look toward the door even once. Cordelia remained there until the 4th burst of laughter struck the low ceiling. Then she adjusted the towels in her arms and continued down the corridor, and her footsteps were heavier than usual. At 4 o'clock in the afternoon, Jonah Prue helped Meredith carry 2 pots of roses into the rear courtyard. At 4:30, he asked for an empty jar to keep worms in. At 10 minutes before 5, Mr. Prue whistled twice outside the garden gate, and the boy ran out, then turned back and waved from beside the hedge before disappearing behind the stone wall. The 2 of them went home at 5 o'clock every day, even in summer, even when there was still daylight. Meredith stood in the doorway watching until there was nothing left to see. Then she went back inside, closed the door, and sat down before the bundle of white paper. She wrote the date, she wrote the time. 9:15 in the morning, Dr. Thorne arrived, carrying a brown leather case with brass clasps. 4 o'clock in the afternoon, Gates replaced the water in the pitcher in the library, and she sat for a very long time before the final line of the page, her pen motionless, ink gathering into a small dot on the paper. Then she added one more line, the 9th of the day, and it had no time beside it at all. Today there was laughter in this house. On the 12th day, at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, Gates knocked on the door of the room beneath the stairs and said that the master was going into the city and wanted her to accompany him. Meredith asked why. Gates said, "He didn't explain, Mom. He never explains." She removed her apron, washed her hands, and went out to the front courtyard, where the black 1967 Cadillac was already running, and August Kels was seated in the front passenger seat beside the driver. He never sat in the back. She understood that when she opened the door and saw the entire rear bench empty, reserved for her alone. They drove along the lakeshore and then turned into the city, and at Wacker Street the car began to descend, below street level, below even the buildings, into the long tunnel running beneath Chicago that people called Lower Wacker, where the only light came from yellow bulbs spaced about 20 yards apart, and concrete pillars past the windows at regular intervals like the beat of a clock. On the dashboard, the hands showed 12 minutes past 4. Then 2 dark sport utility vehicles crept out from a turn on the right, moving very slowly, and blocked the roadway ahead. The driver, whose name was Voss, slammed on the brakes. Meredith looked back and saw that a 3rd vehicle had sealed off the road behind them. 3 seconds. During those 3 seconds, no one in the car said a word. Then came a hard, dry, brief explosion that struck the concrete and shattered into 10 more sounds, and the window on the right cracked into a white spiderweb before collapsing in a shower of tiny fragments across August Kessler's shoulder, and the car filled with the smell of scorched metal. Meredith didn't think. Later, She would try to remember what had gone through her mind, and she would find nothing at all, not a single thought, only that both her hands had been on his shoulders, and the full weight of her body had been against his back, and she had dragged him below the level of the seat, down onto the floor of the car, and lain over him with one arm wrapped around the back of his neck, the way someone shields something fragile during an earthquake. He was very light. That was the only thing she could remember. The man was so light that she could hold him down. And August Kessler removed her arm. He didn't do it roughly. He simply raised one hand, closed it around her wrist, and lifted it away from his neck as though removing a collar, and then he sat upright. Voss shouted something from the driver's seat. August didn't listen. He reached out and turned the handle for the broken window on the right, lowering what remained of its frame slowly, 2 turns, then 3, until there was nothing left between his face and the tunnel. Then he leaned out and looked. Meredith lay on the floor of the car with one cheek pressed against the mud-stained rubber mat, and she looked up at him from below, and she saw his chin, the collar of his white shirt, and a shard of glass still resting on the shoulder of his gray coat. He was looking outside with the expression of a man watching a baseball game from an expensive seat. "Get down," she said. "I want to see their faces," he replied. He said it no louder than he would have asked the time. Behind them came the scrape of tires against concrete, the slam of car doors, the sound of men running, and then the wail of sirens drifting in from the northern mouth of the tunnel. And the 3 vehicles began to reverse, and one of them roared forward only to be blocked by a 4th car Meredith had never seen before and would later learn belonged to Voss. August remained sitting upright in the front seat. He didn't duck once. Half an hour later, they stood in an underground parking area at the far end of the tunnel beneath the pale white glare of fluorescent lights, and 4 of August's men formed a straight line in front of the 3 sport utility vehicles that had been trapped against the concrete wall. Inside those 3 vehicles were 7 men. Meredith stood beside the open door of the Cadillac, with both hands holding her elbows, and she looked down at her feet and saw fragments of glass clinging to the toes of her shoes. August Kessler walked forward and stopped before the line of men. He didn't look at the 7 men from the other vehicles. He looked at Voss. He stood there for a long time, with his left hand in his coat pocket, while the tunnel behind him remained dark and damp, and water dripped from somewhere in the ceiling. Then he spoke the only sentence he would say during those 40 minutes. "Don't touch anyone wearing a wedding ring." Then he turned and walked back to the car. On the drive to Ashgrove Hill, no one spoke. Voss drove more slowly than usual. Wind rushed through the empty frame of the window on the right and lifted August's hair, and he didn't raise his collar, and he looked out across the lake as darkness settled over it. Meredith sat on the rear bench with both hands resting on her knees, and she stared down at them. She thought slowly, one word at a time, the way a person reads an inscription on a grave they don't want to read. If he had died in that tunnel, her father's debt would have been erased within 30 days. Ruthie would have had a lawyer. Meredith would never have had to rise at 5 o'clock in the morning again. The entire 4-page contract would have fulfilled itself, without requiring her to do anything, without asking her to wait another month, without forcing her to watch him lose another pound. And she had thrown herself over him. She had done it before she had time to think, and now that she had thought about it, she knew she would do exactly the same thing again, and that was what frightened her. In the front seat, August Kessler remained motionless for 20 minutes. Then he turned his head about a quarter of the way, just enough to see in the rearview mirror the 2 hands resting on the knees of the woman in the back seat. He looked at them for a very long time. He said nothing. But when the car turned through the gates of Ashgrove Hill, he was the one who opened the door for her. That night, Meredith couldn't sleep. She sat beneath the lamp in the room, with the window level with the ground, both hands resting on the bundle of white paper, and she couldn't write a single line, because the thought that had come to her on the back seat of the Cadillac was still there, refusing to leave, returning again and again to one very simple question she had avoided for 6 weeks. What was she waiting for that man to die for? She knew the answer. She had known it before she signed her name beneath 4 pages in a cafe on Detroit Avenue. But tonight, for the first time, that answer had a face, and it wasn't the face of August Kessler. 15 months earlier, on a Wednesday morning in late April, Meredith Lane had sat on a long wooden bench outside a courtroom in the Cuyahoga County Family Court in Cleveland, and she had sat there alone. She wore a navy blue wool coat, the only respectable coat left in her closet, the one she had worn to 4 job interviews and had washed by hand the night before, then draped over the back of a chair to dry. She had worn low shoes, tied back her hair, and trimmed her fingernails. In her pocket, she carried a sheet of paper folded into quarters, and on that paper she had written 9 sentences, and for 3 nights in a row she had stood before the cracked mirror in the bathroom of her 3rd-floor apartment, practicing those 9 sentences until she could say them without trembling. The first sentence was, "I have found steady work at the Rothmore Hotel." The second was, "I have paid my rent on time for the past 11 months. The third was, "She knows her letters." The 6th was, "I have never let her miss a meal." She no longer remembered the 9th sentence, because she never had the chance to say it. No one sat beside her on that bench. She had done everything in her life alone, and she saw no reason why that day should be any different. At 9:35 they called her name. Courtroom number 2 was smaller than she had imagined, with a low ceiling, a slowly turning fan, and the smell of old paper and floor wax. On the other side stood 2 men in suits, one from Child Protective Services and one representing the other family. Meredith stood beside her own table without a lawyer, because she couldn't afford one, and the young woman assigned to represent her had only recently graduated, had arrived 20 minutes late, and still hadn't opened the case file. The judge was a silver-haired woman in her 60s. She didn't look at Meredith even once. She turned a page in the file, read, turned another page, read again, and did it slowly and evenly, like someone counting money. Then she looked up, but she looked toward the Child Protective Services representative rather than toward Meredith, and she asked a single question. "Miss Lane, what offense is your father currently serving time for?" Meredith opened her mouth. The 9 sentences she had practiced before the mirror remained folded into quarters inside her coat pocket. She heard herself answer, and her voice sounded very calm, very clear, very far away, as though it belonged to someone else standing at the end of the corridor. She spoke the charge aloud, exactly as it had been printed in the newspapers. The judge nodded once. She lowered her head and wrote something. The representative for the other family spoke 17 sentences, and Meredith didn't hear a single one of them because she was watching the ceiling fan and counting its rotations. The young lawyer said 4 sentences. The judge didn't ask Meredith anything else. She read the ruling in the voice of someone reading the weather forecast. Temporary custody was awarded to the approved foster family. Visitation was suspended until a valid appeal had been filed and a complete period of supervision had been fulfilled. The mother retained the right to communicate by letter, 1 letter each week, delivered through Child Protective Services. In-person visitation would be reconsidered when the child reached 18 years of age, or earlier if the court received an appeal supported by evidence of stable housing and stable income maintained for no fewer than 18 consecutive months. The gavel fell. That wooden gavel struck the desk and rose and struck it again, and the sound wasn't loud, quieter than a door closing, quieter than a glass being set down on a stone table. They called the next case number before Meredith had managed to step away from where she stood. She went out into the corridor. She sat down on the same wooden bench. She took the paper folded into quarters from her coat pocket and opened it and looked at the 9 sentences written in handwriting as small as grains of sand, and then she folded it again and returned it to her pocket. Then she looked up at the round clock hanging on the corridor wall, the same clock she had looked at when she entered courtroom number 2, 9:35. Now it was 9:46, 11 minutes. She remembered because she had counted. On the 21st day, Meredith Lane took the leather-bound notebook from where it had remained beside the brass scale, and for the first time in 9 months, she opened it. She turned the pages very slowly. She didn't read. She passed the pages of formulas, the pages bearing the names of regular customers, the pages recording liquor prices from 1994, and she moved through them the way someone walks down a corridor, hung with photographs of the dead. Eyes fixed straight ahead. She stopped at page 61. On that page, in the grain-like handwriting of the man who had taught her to write, there was a table of calculations: concentration, density, volume, a column of numbers, a ruled line. In the left margin, he had written 4 words in pencil, and those 4 words had faded from 20 years of hands brushing across them, Draw slowly, no one knows. Her father had used that table to dilute strong liquor for customers who had drunk too much but didn't want anyone to see them being refused. He had mixed them exactly the drink they ordered, with the same color, the same smell, the same bitterness at the tip of the tongue, and they drank it throughout the evening and walked home on their own feet and never knew. He had done it for 20 years. He had never told anyone. Meredith left the notebook open on the stone work table and sat looking at that table for 40 minutes. Then she rose, took a glass flask from the lowest drawer, and began distilling water. She boiled tap water in the copper pot, collected the steam through a tube, and by midnight she had 400 milliliters of clear distilled water, odorless and tasteless, no different from the water. Dr. Wesley Thorne poured into the glass each evening from the white porcelain pitcher in the library. She filtered it 3 times. She sealed the flask. She fixed a label to it, and on the label she wrote rosewater. Dr. Thorne's brown leather case never left his hand when he came through the front door. But Ashgrove Hill had 41 doors and a cloakroom beneath the main staircase, and Dr. Wesley Thorne, like every 52-year-old man in the world, never carried his case into the lavatory. He placed it on the velvet upholstered chair at the landing. He left it there for about 4 minutes, sometimes 5. Meredith had recorded that on the bundle of white paper on the 11th day, 1 line, without adjectives, without speculation, and she had underlined it with a ruler. On the night of the 21st day, she stood on the landing between the 2 floors beneath the brass lamp, pressed close to the shadow of the wall, with the flask of distilled water hidden in her apron pocket and a glass pipette as long as her finger. 4 minutes, she opened the case. She removed the dark amber bottle. She pulled out the cork, and she did exactly what her father had done for 20 years in a room behind a counter at the Rothmore Hotel in Cleveland. She drew out 1 portion. She replaced it with 1 portion of distilled water. She pushed the cork back in. She turned the bottle 3 times, exactly 3 times, in the same direction Thorne always swirled the glass. She returned the bottle to the case, fastened the clasps, and went down to the kitchen to wash the pipette. That night, she stood on the 2nd floor balcony and counted 12 drops falling into the glass, and she watched August Kessler drink it in 3 swallows and thank the man who had poured it, and nothing changed. Not suddenly, little by little. That was what her father had written in the margin of page 61, and it was the only thing she still accepted from him. Draw it out too quickly and the tongue will know. Draw it out too quickly and the scale will know. On the 2nd night, she removed another portion, smaller than the first. On the 3rd night, she did the same. By the 5th night, she had replaced nearly 1/4 of the bottle, and she had recorded every instance at the end of the bundle of white paper. A column for the date, a column for the volume, a column for her own signature, because if anyone ever read those pages, that person had to see that she had recorded everything she did. On the 6th night, August coughed less. On the 7th night, he finished his entire plate for the first time in 22 days. Meredith wrote that down. She recorded it a single line, without adjectives, and on the 8th night, standing on the landing with the bottle in her hand, she looked down at her hands and realized something she had avoided seeing for 8 nights. Dr. Wesley Thorne was a careful man. He counted drops. He swirled the glass 3 times. He entrusted the bottle to no one, and once each month on the 1st day, before he prepared a fresh batch, he placed the bottle on the small scale he carried in his case and recorded its weight in a blue-covered notebook. She had seen him do it. On the 1st day of the previous month, at 9:20 in the morning, on the small table in the library, while she was polishing the stair rail, she had seen it, and she had written it down, the 3rd line from the top, together with the time. She had begun on the 21st day. There were 9 days left until the 1st. She knew. She had calculated it from the 1st night, sitting beneath the small ground-level window, with her father's notebook open on the stone work table, and she had calculated that if she drew it out as slowly as he had taught her, then by the 1st day she would have replaced only a little more than 1/3, and 1/3 wouldn't save anyone. She needed 4 months. She had 9 days. She poured another portion of distilled water into the bottle and replaced the cork, and she thought, very calmly, standing beneath the brass lamp on the landing inside the sleeping house. She wouldn't be in time. On the 27th night, Meredith stood on the landing with the amber bottle in her left hand and the glass pipette in her right, while the brass lamp on the wall cast her shadow across the yellow-painted plaster, and she heard someone breathe behind her. She didn't turn around at once. She replaced the cork, returned the bottle to the case, fastened the clasps, and did each of those things slowly in the proper order, because a trembling hand was a hand that spilled. Only then did she turn. Cordelia Breese stood 3 steps away, still holding a stack of clean towels. The 2 women looked at each other beneath the brass lamp, for long enough that one of them had to speak. Meredith didn't. She had stood like this once before, in a room on the 2nd floor on the 2nd morning after the wedding, and she had learned that this woman never spoke first. Cordelia stepped forward, placed the stack of towels on the velvet-upholstered chair where no one had ever sat, and then sat down beside them. She lowered herself heavily, both hands resting on her knees, her back bowed, her eyes fixed on the floor, and Meredith stood there with the glass pipette still in her hand, waiting to hear her call for Gates. Cordelia Bryce called no one. She began to cry. She cried without making a sound. Her shoulders didn't shake. Tears simply ran down the deep lines on either side of her mouth and fell onto her white apron, and she didn't lift a hand to wipe them away. And Meredith stood frozen because in the 6.5 weeks she had lived in that house, she had never once seen that woman sit down. She was about to say something. Cordelia raised one hand, palm outward, and Meredith fell silent. "I spoke," she said it to the floor. "Do you hear me, Miss Lane?" I spoke. I wasn't silent. "People will tell you that the old woman knew for all those years and kept her mouth shut. And they'll be right about the 2nd half, and wrong about the 1st. And it is the 1st half that is killing me." She looked up. Her eyes were red, but her voice didn't break. 20 years ago I was 43, and I ran this house exactly as I do now. His father was still alive then, a large, loud man who used to strike the table with his hand when he laughed. He went to Cleveland for 3 days, came home, and 3 weeks later he was bedridden. The same cough, the same coat growing looser around him. The doctor called it exhaustion. Everyone along the lakeshore called it the curse. She smoothed the apron over her knees once, then lowered her hand. I carried water to him every night. 1 glass. Filtered water, mixed with the tonic they sent upstairs. And one night, I was holding that glass in my hand at the foot of these stairs, exactly where you're standing now, and I smelled something that didn't belong in it. I didn't know what to call it. I only knew that in 30 years of washing glasses for this house, I had never smelled it before. Meredith didn't move. "I carried that glass to the 3rd floor, Cordelia said. "I knocked on Mr. Emery Hale's door. You wouldn't know him. He died 14 months ago. He was the lady of the house's brother-in-law. He lived here. He was the only man in this house everyone trusted. He taught Master August to fish. He carried the boy on his shoulders through the rose garden. I knocked on his door at 11 o'clock at night and handed him the glass, and I said, 'Sir, there is something wrong with the smell of this.'" She stopped. "Somewhere on the 3rd floor, a door closed. And he took the glass," she said. "He raised it to his nose. He smelled it for a long time. Then he set it on the desk, stood up, walked around the desk, and placed his hand on my shoulder. He told me, 'Mrs. Bryce, you're a good woman.' He told me there wasn't anyone in the whole house with eyes like mine. He told me to go to bed and that he would take care of it." The tears were still falling. She still didn't wipe them away. "I went to bed," she said. "I slept soundly. I slept soundly for 20 years, Miss Lane, because I had done exactly what a decent woman was supposed to do. I had seen, I had spoken, I had told the right person, and 3 weeks later the master stopped breathing, and at the funeral Emery Hale stood beside me and handed me his handkerchief." Meredith set the glass pipette on the chair very gently, because her hand had begun to tremble. "Evil doesn't need to silence anyone," Cordelia said. "It only needs to be the person everyone reports to. It only needs to stand in the right place, the place people will run to." She let out a long breath. "I have a son, Ellis. He's 41 now. 7 years ago he was sentenced to 12 years, and I won't tell you why, because he is my son and he has paid for it. He's in Joliet. He has 5 years left." And 1 week after the sentence was handed down, Emery Hale knocked on the door of my room beneath the kitchen. He had never come below the kitchen in 30 years. He stood in the doorway. He didn't sit. And he said one sentence to me before going back upstairs. Cordelia Breese lifted her head and looked directly into Meredith's face, and she repeated that sentence in the flat voice of someone who had repeated it inside her own mind every night for 7 years. He said, "I still remember what you told me 20 years ago, Mrs. Bryce. If you tell anyone again, I'll remember whose mother you are." The two women remained there beneath the brass lamp, one standing and one sitting, and neither spoke for a very long time. Then Cordelia rose. She picked up the stack of clean towels, straightened them in her arms, and wiped her face once with the back of her hand. "He's dead," she said. 14 months ago. I stood in the cemetery and thought it was over, that I was free." She looked down at the brown leather case resting on the velvet chair. "But evil doesn't die with a man, Miss Lane. It lies inside his will. It is inherited." She walked 3 steps toward the staircase. Then she stopped without turning around. "How much longer do you need?" 9 days, Meredith said. "That isn't enough." "It isn't enough," she said. Cordelia stood still. "Then I'll stand at the foot of the stairs," she said, "beginning tomorrow night. And if he comes down before 4 minutes have passed, I'll drop a stack of plates. On the first day of the month, at 9:20 in the morning." Dr. Wesley Thorne opened the brown leather case on the small table in the library and took out the stainless steel pocket scale he always used when measuring a new batch. Meredith stood at the end of the corridor with a bucket of water and a rag, polishing the stair rail so slowly that her hand barely seemed to move. He placed the amber bottle on the scale. He looked at the number. He said nothing. He didn't frown, didn't sigh, didn't lift the bottle toward the light. He simply wrote a number in the blue-covered notebook, put away the scale, put away the notebook, fastened the case, and carried it toward the front door. And in the entrance hall he stopped for exactly 4 seconds to tell Gates that the weather was fine that day. Meredith watched through the narrow corridor window. He didn't get into his own automobile. He walked around behind the carriage house to where a dark blue-green car was parked beneath the shade of a plane tree, and he stood beside its door, speaking to the person inside for exactly 1 minute and 10 seconds, and he gave that person nothing, and that person gave him nothing. Then he got into his own car and drove away. The dark blue-green car remained for another 15 minutes. Preston Kessler Hale didn't enter the house that morning. He returned at 7 o'clock in the evening, carrying a box of chestnut pastries from the shop on Rush Street that the head cook liked, and he remembered the name of the head cook's niece, and he asked after Gates's knee. There was laughter in the kitchen. Dinner began at 8 o'clock. The small table had only 4 places and stood in the east dining room beneath 2 candles beside a vase of white chrysanthemums. August Kessler sat at the head. Meredith was on his right, Preston was on his left. Dr. Thorne had sent his regrets that afternoon because of a patient in Evanston, and he had left the amber bottle with careful instructions for Gates. And Gates had placed it on the silver tray atop the sideboard behind August, beside the drinking glass and the white porcelain pitcher. The first course was pumpkin soup. Preston told a story about the chairman of the harbor board falling into the lake during the launching ceremony the previous year, and he told it well. And August laughed, and the cough didn't come. The second course was roasted sea bass. Halfway through the second course, Preston stood. He said, "I'll pour it for you, August. Sit still. Gates is busy in the kitchen." He walked 3 steps to the sideboard. He turned his back to the table. Meredith watched the back of that gray suit, watched the 2 shoulder blades remain perfectly still, and she heard the cork being pulled. She didn't hear any counting. No drops fell. There was only the sound of liquid pouring in one continuous, steady stream, longer than 3 seconds, longer than 5, and Meredith set down her fork. She stood. Preston Kessler Hale turned with the glass in his hand and smiled at her, a warm and slightly surprised smile, and said, "Sit down, my dear niece. I can manage." He placed the glass beside August's right hand. The liquid inside it wasn't clear. It had color, a pale amber color, and Meredith had stood on the second-floor balcony for 28 nights, and she knew that glass had never held any color before. "Don't," she said. She didn't say it loudly. August Kessler had already lifted the glass. He did it from habit without looking, still turning his head toward his uncle to hear the end of the story, and he drank 3 swallows, and he set the glass down, and he said, "Thank you, Uncle." Then he lifted his fork. 3 seconds, perhaps 4. The fork stopped in midair. Meredith saw his neck stiffen, saw the 2 fingers around the fork handle extend and then contract, saw his eyes widen and fix on the vase of white chrysanthemums, as though he were trying to read a word written there. Then he collapsed forward. The china plate slid from the table and shattered on the wooden floor. The candle on the right toppled and went out. Cordelia Bryce had just stepped through the doorway carrying the dessert tray, and she screamed, one short scream that tore through the room, and the tray fell. Preston rose. His face had gone white. He called for Gates, called loudly, called twice, and said, "Call an ambulance. Call now. Call Northwestern Hospital and Meredith Lane." Kneeling on the wooden floor with that man's head in her lap, looked up and said, "No." The entire room looked at her. She heard her own voice very clearly and from very far away, as though it belonged to someone else standing at the end of a long corridor. A hospital means records. Records mean police who will be inside this house before midnight. And the police will find the medicine box in the drawer beside his bed. The tin medicine box someone told me to carry down to the kitchen and wipe clean on the morning of the wedding, because people so often forget the little things. And that box will bear my fingerprints, and only my fingerprints. And I'm his wife, and I inherit if he dies. And my father died in prison. She looked directly into Preston Kessler Hale's face. He stood beside the overturned chair with one hand still resting on its back, and during those 3 seconds something passed across his face, very quickly, like a door opening a crack and closing again. Then he said, "You're panicking, my dear niece." And he said it in the warmest voice in the world. Meredith turned toward Voss, who was standing in the doorway with his hat in his hand. "Carry him to the room beneath the east wing staircase," she said. "You and one other man. Go through the kitchen. Now." Voss didn't look at Preston. He looked at Cordelia Bryce. And Cordelia Bryce nodded once, and 2 men bent down and lifted August Kessler from the wooden floor. And Meredith walked ahead to open the door, and in her hand was the glass, still 2/3 full, which she had taken from the dining table before anyone else had thought of it. They laid him on the narrow iron bed Voss had carried down from the servants' quarters, and placed it against the wall of drawers beneath the small window level with the ground. Meredith locked the door. She set the glass, still 2/3 full, on the stone work table beside the brass scale, and she didn't touch it for 3 nights. She did what her father had written on page 61 and what he had never written on any page at all. She gave August weak salt water 1 spoonful at a time, 1 spoon every 15 minutes. She wiped his body with cloths soaked in warm water. She raised the foot of the bed on 2 stacks of books. She counted the pulse at his wrist by the clock on the wall and recorded the number on the white paper, 1 line every hour for 72 hours, and later those pages would be read aloud by a woman in a black robe before a courtroom in Cook County. But that night they were only a column of numbers. Cordelia brought hot water down 4 times each night and didn't ask a single question. Gates kept watch at the end of the east wing corridor with a chair, though no one had told him to do so. On the first night, August said nothing. On the second night, he began to speak. He spoke at about 2 o'clock in the morning, his eyes closed, his head turned to one side, and his voice was the voice of a man explaining something perfectly reasonable to someone very patient. "Your hands keep shaking," he said. "You can't hold it. They won't stop shaking." Then he fell silent. An hour later, he said, "The floor smells of paint. Who has just painted the church floor?" Meredith sat on the wooden stool beside the bed with both hands resting in her lap and listened. Near dawn, he spoke the longest sentence of the entire night. He had a dog. He didn't ask for himself. He asked who would feed it. Then he coughed, and the fit went on, and when it ended, he breathed out one more sentence, very softly, almost without sound. "I was 21. Meredith didn't write that sentence on the white paper. On the third night, his pulse steadied at 68, and at 11 o'clock he opened his eyes. He looked at the low ceiling. He looked at the small window. Then he turned his head and saw her sitting on the stool, and she saw in his eyes the moment he remembered that he had spoken in delirium, and the moment he knew she had heard him. He didn't ask what she had heard. He lay still for a long time, then he began to speak, and his voice was hoarse but clear, and he spoke like a man reading a statement he had written in his mind 13 years ago. "The man who took me down into the basement of St. Adalbert wasn't my father. My father died when I was 14. 7 years later, I was 21, and the man who led me down those stairs was Uncle Emery." Meredith didn't move. "He killed my father," August said. "I've known that for 10 months. Before that, I didn't know. Before that, all I knew was that he was the man who taught me to tie a fishing hook at Lake Geneva. He taught me how to knot a tie. He sat in the second row when I graduated. He took me down into that basement, and he didn't go down with me. He stood outside the door and waited for me to come back up." He paused. "Out on the lake, a freighter sounded its horn. I went down with clean hands," he said, "and I came back up with different ones. He waited for me at the top of the stairs and handed me his handkerchief. The same handkerchief he gave Mrs. Bryce at my father's funeral, Miss Lane. I only learned that last week, and I suppose he owned just one. Meredith opened her mouth, but no sound came out. You're asking why I didn't fight, August said. I'll answer you. Fight what? I sit on money belonging to people who will never get it back. I have 7 men willing to die for me, and I'm not worthy of one of them. And I was shaped by the same hands that killed my father. I don't know what is left inside me that is mine, he breathed. 2 months after my father's funeral, I began to lose weight. The cough came, my coats grew loose, the same thing in the same order. I knew by last spring. I had the desk lamp installed in the study 10 months ago, and I sat listening to recordings every Tuesday night. I knew. I just didn't know who would be the one to do it. I sat and waited to see who was brave enough. He turned his face toward the wall. Then he married me to you, he said, and I began to want to live. That was the worst thing he ever did to me. Meredith sprang up from the stool. The stool toppled over. You had no right. She heard her own voice break, and she couldn't stop. You had no right, do you hear me? You signed the paper that made me your widow. You knew that medicine box carried my fingerprints. You knew where my father died. And you knew they would read that name aloud in a courtroom, and no one in the state of Illinois would need to hear another word. You knew all of it, and still, every night, you sat in that armchair, drank it in 3 swallows, and said, Thank you, Wesley. She stood in the middle of the room with both hands clenched, tears running down her face without her knowing. You meant to die and settle your debt with yourself, and you meant to let them write my name into the empty space. I have a daughter, Mr. Kessler. She is 5 years old. She is in Cleveland. You arranged my whole life while you sat there waiting to see who was brave enough. The only sounds left in the room were the breathing of 2 people and the clock on the wall. August Kessler lay facing the wall for a very long time. Then he turned back slowly and painfully, looked up at the ceiling, and spoke one sentence, and his voice had changed. You have a daughter I didn't know, Meredith said. No one knows. It is in the court records in Cuyahoga County. Your uncle knew. He even remembered her name. There was a very long silence. Then August Kessler raised his right hand, palm upward, and laid it on the edge of the iron bed, and he said nothing, and he left it there. Meredith looked at that hand. She looked at it for a long time. Then she picked up the fallen stool, set it upright, sat down and placed her hand in his. By morning he was asleep, and she sat in the gray light coming through the small window level with the ground, her hand still resting in his, and she looked across at the glass, still 2/3 full, standing on the stone work table beside the brass scale of a dead woman. And for the first time in 34 days inside that house, Meredith Lane didn't think about running away. On the 38th day, August Kessler walked from the iron bed to the door and back again, and he did it 4 times that morning and 11 times that afternoon, and he allowed no one to support him. Meredith didn't support him. She sat on the wooden stool with the bundle of white paper in her lap, counting his steps and writing them down, and once he stopped in the middle of the room with one hand braced against the edge of the stone work table, and he said, Count, and she said, I'm counting, and he continued. Outside the oak door, along the east wing corridor, 7 men stood waiting. They had been standing there since the night of the 1st. No one had told them to. Voss came first, then Deacon, then the Ostrander brothers, then Peel, then Cutter, and finally Lonnie Marsh. The youngest, 26 years old, who stood in the most hidden place near the foot of the stairs and spoke to no one. They worked in shifts, 3 during the day, 4 at night. They brought bread wrapped in paper and ate standing up. Cordelia carried coffee down to them every morning, and they nodded their thanks, and not one of them drank before the man beside him did. In the 38 days Meredith had lived at Ashgrove Hill. She had never looked closely at those men, but now, passing them 4 times a day with a bucket of water and clean towels, she began to see them. Voss had a white scar running along the back of his right hand. Deacon read the sports pages and folded the newspaper into quarters before placing it in his pocket. The Ostrander brothers never stood beside each other. On the afternoon of the 38th day, August opened the door and stood in the doorway with one hand braced against the frame, and he looked out into the corridor. All 7 men straightened. No one greeted him. No one spoke. He looked at them one by one from left to right, and he looked for a long time, and during those 30 seconds, no one in that house breathed. Then he said, Come inside, Harlan. Harlan Voss entered. He was 60 years old, holding his hat in his left hand, and he stood in the center of the room, in exactly the same place where another man had once knelt on the rug upstairs, and Meredith realized it and lowered her eyes to the white paper in her lap. August sat on the edge of the iron bed. He took 3 breaths before he could speak. "Since when?" he asked. Voss turned the hat once in his hands. "Since spring, sir," he said. "We've known since spring." Deacon saw the bottle carried into the carriage house twice in 1 week, and each time another bottle came out. "Lonnie was standing guard outside the dining room the night you were sick after supper in April, and you told him not to tell anyone." The elder Ostrander drove Dr. Thorne back to Evanston 4 times, and all 4 times the doctor got out at another house. "As for me, I've been driving you for 3 years, and I count how much weight you've lost by how far the front seat sinks beneath you, sir. All 7 of us knew. We talked among ourselves in the carriage house. No one in this house spoke of it to anyone else, except the 7 of us speaking to one another in the carriage house." August sat motionless. "Then why didn't you tell me?" Voss turned the hat once more. He looked down at his shoes and answered slowly, like a man paying a debt he had always known he owed. "Because you didn't ask, sir." He looked up. "And because we thought it was what you wanted." The clock on the wall continued ticking. Meredith sat on the wooden stool and watched something break very slowly across August Kessler's face. Not anger, not pain, but something else. Something seen only on the face of a man who has just realized that his silence won't die with him, that it has flowed out beneath the study door, and down the stairs, and into the carriage house, and that 7 men have stood in the darkness for 6 months out of respect for something none of them dared to name. He raised a hand to his face. He left it there for a very long time. Then he said, "Thank you, Harlan," and Voss bowed his head, left the room, and closed the door behind him. Only 2 people remained. Meredith folded the bundle of paper. "I want to ask you something," she said. "I've wanted to ask since the 2nd day." He nodded. 300 seats in the great hall," she said. "I scrubbed that floor on both knees during my first week, and I know how many footsteps long it is." The cook ordered flowers for 120 people and then canceled them. Then she ordered for 80 and canceled again. By the wedding day, there were only 40 chairs. And every night for 2 weeks, Gates carried a list up to the 3rd floor, and every morning he brought it down, and it had grown shorter. "You crossed out the names yourself. I saw you 3 times from beside the stair rail." August Kessler looked down at the hands resting on his knees. He didn't answer at once. When he spoke, he used the calm voice he always used when asking the time. "I crossed out a few each night," he said. "I began with 300 names, and I reduced them to 40. He looked up. "Those 40 people were the 40 people I wanted at my funeral, Miss Lane. That was all. I couldn't think of any other way to choose. I finished arranging my funeral 2 weeks before that day, and I invited you to be the bride." Out in the corridor, one of the 7 men shifted his weight, and the scrape of a shoe against the stone floor came through the narrow gap beneath the door. Meredith sat very still on the wooden stool. Then she opened the bundle of white paper, picked up her pen, and said, "Now you will walk from the bed to the door 10 more times." He looked at her. "The funeral has been postponed, sir," she said. "Walk, on the 41st day, at 10 o'clock in the morning." Preston Kessler Hale knocked on the door of the room beneath the east wing staircase and stood in the doorway with both hands empty, and he asked whether she could spare him a few minutes. "My dear niece." He had called her that ever since the wedding day. Meredith set down the scale. She followed him. No one came with them. No one waited in the corridor. And August's 7 men were on the 3rd floor because their employer was holding a meeting that morning about the dock number 7 contract. Preston led her down another level to an empty room in the basement where coal had once been stored, and now there was nothing inside except a wooden table, 2 chairs, and a bare bulb hanging from a cord. He didn't close the door. He left it wide open, and the staircase leading up to the kitchen was directly behind Meredith, and she could see a strip of sunlight lying across the 3rd step. He pulled out a chair for her. She didn't sit. He did. Preston placed his briefcase on the table, opened it, and took out a single sheet of paper. He slid it across the wood, turned it so that it faced her properly, and leaned back in his chair with both hands folded across his stomach. Meredith looked down. It was a form from the Cuyahoga County Family Court in Ohio. She recognized it because she had carried one exactly like it for 15 months, folded into quarters inside the pocket of her navy blue wool coat. Petition for the permanent termination of communication rights. between a biological mother and a minor child, currently in the care of an adoptive family. Her name had already been typed on the first line. Her daughter's name had already been typed on the second. The date had been entered. The case number had been entered. The grounds had been entered, 3 typed paragraphs citing Wendell Lane's conviction, and the mother's current residence in a household where the health of the head of the household was under investigation. At the bottom of the page was an empty space for the signature of the attorney filing the petition. It was blank. "I know 3 people who can sign there," Preston said. He didn't say it as a threat. He said it like a man announcing a train schedule. "One is in Cleveland, one is in Columbus, and one had dinner with me on Tuesday. If I call any one of those 3 tomorrow morning, this paper will be filed before 11 o'clock, and the court will hear it within 6 weeks, and no one will be standing at the other table. You'll never know what that little girl looks like when she grows up, Meredith. Not one photograph, not one written line. You'll live to be 70 years old, and you'll never know." The bulb hanging from the cord swayed gently because someone had closed a door on the floor above. He took out a second sheet of paper. He placed it beside the first, perfectly aligned, their upper edges even. A sworn affidavit, already typed. It stated that the undersigned, Meredith Lane, admitted that beginning on the 21st of September, she had deliberately interfered with her husband's prescribed medication by replacing a portion of the solution with distilled water, without the consent of either the attending physician or the patient. 3 lines, not one word was untrue. He placed his heavy fountain pen on the table between the 2 pages and pushed it forward with one finger. "You aren't being held here," he said. "The door is open. You may walk upstairs and leave through the gate whenever you wish, and I won't lift a finger." Meredith looked at the open door. She looked at the strip of sunlight on the 3rd step. She picked up the pen. She signed her name beneath the affidavit in the tiny grain-like handwriting her father had taught her. Preston Kessler Hale lifted the paper, blew gently across it to dry the ink, and placed it inside his briefcase. He left the family court petition lying unsigned on the table, directly in the center of the wood. He rose, fastened the button of his coat, thanked her, and went up the stairs. Meredith stood alone in the old coal room beneath the hanging bulb. Then she went upstairs. She passed through the kitchen, through the east wing corridor, past the 7 empty chairs, out the rear door, across the gravel courtyard, and she walked to the iron gate. She placed one hand on the crossbar. The metal was cold, and black paint flaked away beneath her thumb. Beyond it lay the paved road running along the lakeshore, and the train station was 4 miles away, and she had $38 in her pocket. No one stood behind her. She remained there for a very long time. She thought about a Wednesday morning in late April, and a slowly turning ceiling fan, and 11 minutes. And she thought that she had now signed a paper that could send her to prison, and people in prison weren't allowed to write letters. She thought that if she left now, everything would remain exactly as it had been on the day she signed the 4 pages in the cafe, except for one thing. She had read page 61, and she had spent 3 nights with another person's hand resting in hers. Her fingers tightened around the iron bar. Then, from somewhere behind the house, carried over the stone wall and through the hedge, came the sound of laughter. A child's laughter, loud and confident, burst at once, fading, then bursting out again. Somewhere on the other side of that wall, someone had just read aloud a label pasted to a wooden drawer and mispronounced it, then laughed at himself before anyone could correct him. Meredith Lane stood at the iron gate with one hand resting on the crossbar, and she listened to that laughter echo through 2 layers of stone walls in a house where no one had laughed for 2 years. She released the bar. She turned back. On the 44th day, Cordelia Breese had the 2nd floor room cleared, and Meredith's belongings moved into a small chamber beside the still room, because she said she couldn't bear to see Meredith sleep on that stool for one more night. They carried the suitcase downstairs and placed it on the bed, and no one opened it. That afternoon, August came down beneath the east wing staircase on his own, without holding on to anything, and entered the still room looking for her, but she was outside in the rear courtyard drying chrysanthemums on a wire tray. He waited. Through the doorway of the small chamber, the suitcase lay open on the bed, because the maid had taken out the clothes to hang them and hadn't yet closed the lid. Inside, beneath the folded garments, was a tin box with a dent in its left corner. August Kessler had lived for 34 years in a house where no one was permitted to touch another person's belongings. He stood looking at that box for a long time. Then he picked it up. He carried it into the still room, placed it on the stone work table beside the brass scale, sat down on the wooden stool, and opened the lid. Meredith entered with the tray of chrysanthemums in her hands and stopped in the doorway. Inside the box was a stack of envelopes. They stood upright with their folded edges facing outward, tied into bundles of 10 with hemp cord. Every envelope bore the same address, written in handwriting as small as grains of sand, to the Cuyahoga County Child Protective Services Agency, to be forwarded to Ruthie Lane. Every envelope had been sealed. Not one had a stamp. August didn't turn around. He counted them. He counted them one by one with his thumb, while Meredith stood in the doorway holding the tray of chrysanthemums and didn't set it down. 62, he said. 62, she replied. He lowered the box. For the first 3 weeks I didn't have money for stamps, she said. They sent my father's court fee notices to my address because he no longer had one of his own. I paid them in weekly installments. For 3 weeks I had 48 cents in my purse, and I needed it for the bus to the hotel. She set the tray on the windowsill. 3 weeks doesn't explain it, Mr. Kessler. A 4-year-old child doesn't understand the words court fees. She doesn't understand the words installment payments. She only knows that 3 times in a row, nothing came. They read the letters to her on Sunday afternoons. For 3 Sunday afternoons, she sat there and there was nothing. She looked down at her hands. By the 4th week, I had the money. I wrote a letter. I sat in front of the sealed envelope and thought that if I sent it, she would ask, "Mother, where were you for the last 3 weeks?" And I had no answer that a 4-year-old could hear without believing her mother had forgotten her. I put that letter in the box. I thought I would find a way to explain it the following week. The following week, I still couldn't. So I kept writing. I wrote 1 letter every week for 62 weeks. And I sealed every one. And I sent none of them. And now there are 62 inside that box. And I don't know where to begin again. August Kessler said nothing. He rose from the stool, took the tin box, and sat down on the stone floor with his back against the rows of wooden drawers labeled in the purple ink of a dead woman. He placed the box on his lap. He took the envelope from the very bottom, the oldest one, and tore it open with his fingers. Then he read. Meredith didn't stop him. She sat on the windowsill beside the tray of chrysanthemums and remained there throughout the evening, and Cordelia brought down an oil lamp, said nothing, and went back upstairs. He read every letter. He tore each envelope open with his thumb, read it, folded the paper along its original creases, placed it on his left, and reached for the next. He read the 11th letter, about a stray cat beside the fire escape. He read the 23rd, which asked, "Do you still remember the song about the boat?" He read the 39th, written on a February night, only 4 lines long, and all 4 lines were apologies. He read until morning. When daylight began to appear through the window level with the ground, he had finished the 62nd letter, and he sat very still for a long time with the stack of pages on his lap. Then Meredith began to speak. She said that her mother had left on a Tuesday morning in October, when Meredith was 15. She said her mother had left a note on the kitchen counter, folded in half, and propped against the sugar jar. She said she found it at 6:40 in the morning before school, and her father was still asleep because he worked the night shift behind the bar and came home at 3 o'clock. She said she read it, folded it again, slipped it into her coat pocket, and went to school. She said that when her father woke that afternoon and asked where her mother was, she told him that her mother had gone to Toledo to visit Aunt Marie, and he nodded and went to work. She said she repeated the same answer on Wednesday night, and Thursday night, and Friday night. She said he mixed drinks for 4 nights in a row, and every night before walking out the door, he asked when her mother would return, and every night Meredith invented a different time. She said that on Sunday afternoon, she placed the note on the dining table and went outside to stand on the fire escape until darkness fell. The oil lamp made a faint sound inside the still room. August Kessler sat on the stone floor, with his back against the drawers, and he looked up at her. 4 days, he said. 4 days, she replied. You were 15. I was 15. He said nothing else. He didn't ask why. He didn't tell her she had done the right thing, and he didn't tell her she had done the wrong thing. And Meredith sat on the windowsill and understood that it was the kindest thing anyone had ever done for her. He rose from the floor, placed all 62 letters back inside the tin box, closed the lid and put it into her hands. Then he went upstairs. At 9 o'clock that evening in the library, Dr. Wesley Thorne opened the brown leather case, took out the amber bottle, and began counting the drops. And August Kessler, seated in the armchair with the book lying face down across the armrest, said something he hadn't said in 2 years. "Wesley, let me see the bottle." Dr. Wesley Thorne didn't come on the 45th day, nor did he come on the 46th. He telephoned in a solicitous voice and said there was a conference in Milwaukee, and he sent enough doses for 1 week in a sealed paper box that Gates received at the front door. August didn't open it. He placed it on the writing desk on the 3rd floor, between the colored glass lamp and the checkbook, and left it there. On the 47th day, Meredith went down to the still room at 6 o'clock in the morning as she did every day, and she did the things she always did, weighing chrysanthemums, filtering water, recording the date and time on the white paper. Then she sat down before her father's leather-bound notebook. She turned to page 61, to the table of concentration calculations, to the 4 words written in pencil that had faded beneath the touch of hands over 20 years. She had opened to that page 26 times in 26 days. She had never turned farther, because 3 pages remained after page 61, and the final page had been fastened to the back cover with a strip of cloudy adhesive tape, applied carelessly, applied by a trembling hand, and in the 9 months since they had sent the notebook back to her with an empty leather wallet and a pair of eyeglasses, she had never touched it. She had told herself that he had sealed it because the page was torn. On the morning of the 47th day, Meredith Lane picked up the fruit knife and cut through the tape. The handwriting trembled. It wasn't the writing as small as grains of sand that he had taught her. This was the hand of a 60-year-old man writing during the final evening he would ever be allowed to sit in his own kitchen. "Mary, if you are reading this, then I didn't tear it out in time. I meant to tear it out. 3 times I left it here, and 3 times I taped it back in. I don't know any other way," she continued reading. 20 years ago, behind the bar at the Rothmore Hotel, her father had mixed a drink for a man. The man had sat on the 4th stool from the end. He drank Islay malt whiskey. He spoke loudly and laughed loudly, and left a $20 tip. Her father had put something into that glass, something a man in a suit had given him in the hotel garage. The man had told him it would only make the customer ill. He had said that her father had a daughter who was 7 years old, a debt, and a bar he wouldn't still have by the following year, and he had promised to take care of her. He had said it slowly and looked directly into her father's eyes, and her father had believed him. The man on the 4th stool died 3 weeks later. Her father read about it in the newspaper. He read the man's name, went into the employee washroom, and sat there until his shift ended. The man in the suit didn't keep his promise. He never returned. Her father waited for him for 20 years behind that bar every night, and the man never walked through the door again. Then last year, they came to arrest her father, and he understood that the man had returned, except this time he hadn't needed to walk through the door. Her father told no one, and he wouldn't tell anyone, because if he did, Meredith would become the daughter of an informant, and he had read enough newspapers to know what happened to the children of informants. He accepted his sentence. He remained silent. He sat there and wrote this. "I am not asking you to forgive me. I have no right to ask that. I am asking only one thing of you, Mary. Never trust a kind man. A kind man is someone who knows exactly what you are missing. Trust the one who can smell what doesn't belong." Meredith Lane sat on the wooden stool in the room beneath the East Wing staircase, her father's leather-bound notebook lying open on the stone work table, and she read the page 3 times. Beyond the window level with the ground came the scrape of a shovel across gravel. The gardener was clearing the beds. Her father had mixed that drink. Her father had killed the father of the man sleeping on the 3rd floor. The man whose hand she had held through an entire night. The man who had sat on this stone floor for 7 hours, reading 62 letters written to a child he had never met. 3 weeks after that man drank the whiskey, he lay bedridden on the 3rd floor of this house, and Cordelia Bryce carried water to him every evening, and a 14-year-old boy sat beside the bed counting every breath. Meredith closed the notebook. She placed both hands on its leather cover and sat perfectly still. Then a thought came to her, quietly, slipping in like cold water rising through the crack beneath a door. When she was 7 years old, she often sat on the high stool in the farthest corner of the Rothmore bar, hidden behind a pillar, with a glass of water containing a slice of lemon and a coloring book, waiting for her father's shift to end at 11 o'clock at night because there was no one at home to watch her. She had sat there hundreds of evenings. She remembered the smell of wood polish. She remembered the sound of glasses touching. She remembered the way her father stood with his back to the room, his shoulders slightly raised whenever he mixed a drink for someone. The fourth stool from the end was exactly 3 steps from her high stool. She would never know for certain whether she had been sitting there that night. No one remained alive to ask. Meredith Lane rose. She placed the notebook in the lowest drawer on the right, the drawer that held the white paper tied with hemp cord. She closed the drawer. She crossed to the basin in the corner, turned on the tap, and washed her hands twice, thoroughly, all the way to her wrists, exactly as her father had taught her to wash them before every shift. She dried them with a clean towel. She removed her apron, folded it, and hung it on its hook. Then she left the room, closed the door behind her, and went upstairs. 4 days later, Cordelia Breese knocked on the stillroom door at 9 o'clock in the evening, and she carried no clean towels, no hot water, nothing but a pale yellow envelope folded in half inside her apron pocket. She closed the door behind her. "Ellis has a cellmate," she said. "The boy finished his sentence last month. He came back to Chicago, and he works at the telephone exchange." Meredith set down her pen. "I've run this house for 30 years, Cordelia said, "and I know every telephone number in it. I gave that boy 3 numbers and asked him one question, and I asked it on the day you stood at the iron gate, and I watched you from the kitchen window and thought you were going to leave." She placed the envelope on the stone work table beside the brass scale, and she didn't open it. "It took me 4 days, she said. Then she walked out and closed the door. Meredith sat looking at the envelope for a long time before she touched it. Inside were 3-dot matrix printouts with perforated edges, rows of numbers arranged in orderly columns, records of outgoing calls from 3 telephone lines during September. The first column showed the date, the second showed the time, the third showed the number called, the fourth showed the duration. She ran one finger down the date column. She stopped at the 12th. The telephone line in the small second-floor study, the room Preston Kessler Hale used whenever he stayed at Ashgrove Hill, 12 minutes past 4 in the afternoon. A number beginning with 403. 38 seconds. Meredith sat perfectly still. On the dashboard of the black 1967 Cadillac, the hands had shown 12 minutes past 4 when the car began descending beneath Wacker Street. And she remembered because she remembered everything, because for 40 days she had written everything down, the times, the order, who touched what. 38 seconds wasn't enough time to discuss anything. 38 seconds was only enough to speak one sentence and hear one answer. She carried the 3 pages to the 3rd floor. August Kessler was sitting behind the writing desk, with Dr. Thorne's sealed paper box still lying where it had been left, unopened and covered with a thin layer of dust. She placed the 3 pages before him and pointed to the 17th line from the top. He read it. He read it very slowly once, and then a second time. Then he sat straighter and said nothing. Margaret had stood beside the desk and said nothing for a minute and a half. She stood there listening to the grandfather clock in the corridor and looking at a crescent-shaped scratch on the wooden desktop, while inside her mind something was turning itself backward from the end to the beginning, slowly, the way someone overturns a chessboard to study it from the other side. No one called Detroit to arrange the murder of a man who was already dying. There was no need. That man would die in November on schedule, in his own bed, with the doctor signing the certificate and 40 people attending the funeral. No one would open an investigation. But if something happened inside a tunnel, there would be an investigation. There would be newspapers. There would be state police walking through this house in muddy boots, and they would open cupboards, and they would find the medicine box, and they would find the bottle. No, not him. Meredith Lane placed one finger on the printed page and spoke the words aloud, and her voice was very calm, and it sounded very far away, as though it belonged to someone else standing at the end of a long corridor. "He wasn't trying to kill you in that tunnel, sir. If a widow dies with her husband, people investigate," she said. "They ask why. They tear this entire house apart. But if a servant girl dies before her husband dies alone, inside a car that isn't hers, in the middle of something involving the docks and men from Detroit, then they write 3 lines on page 11 and bury her in the city cemetery. Then, 3 weeks later, You die in your bed. Right on schedule. And there is no one left in this house who knows how to count drops. She looked up. 12 minutes past 4, she said. I was sitting on the back seat, sir. I always sit on the back seat. He knew that. He married me into that seat. August Kessler looked at the dot matrix printout lying on his desk. He looked at it for a very long time. Then he pushed back his chair and stood, and he walked 3 steps to the tall window overlooking Lake Michigan. And he stood there with his back to her, both hands clasped behind him, while outside, darkness had fallen over the black water, and the lights of a freighter moved very slowly toward the north. He remained that way for so long that Meredith began to hear the sound of her own breathing. Then he said 2 words. So that's it. He didn't turn around. He said nothing else, not that night, not when Cordelia carried up the dinner tray and brought it down again untouched, not when Meredith closed the door and went downstairs. He stood at that window until 2 o'clock in the morning. Gates, passing through the corridor at 1 o'clock, later said that the master was still standing in exactly the same place, and that not one lamp was burning in the room. On the 53rd day, Mr. Prue and his son left the garden at 10 minutes before 5, as they did every day, and Meredith heard 2 whistles beyond the gate, and then the hedge fell silent again. August's 7 men had been gone since noon. They had left because August told them to leave, told them to go down to dock number 7 and wait at warehouse number 9, and he didn't say why, and Harlan Voss didn't ask. The only people left in the house were Gates, counting the silver in the wine cellar, the head cook, who had gone home at 3 o'clock, Cordelia Brees, Meredith Lane, and the man sleeping on the 3rd floor. At 4:20, Cordelia sat at the wooden table in her room beside the kitchen and began to write. She wrote with a ballpoint pen on a sheet of graph paper, and she wrote slowly because her hand had grown stiff and because she had never written a formal statement in her life. She stated her name, her age, and the position she had held in that house for 30 years. She described a night in December 20 years earlier, a glass, a strange smell, and she stated that she had carried that glass to the 3rd floor and knocked on the door of a man named Emery Hale. She recorded every word he had spoken. She recorded the funeral and the handkerchief. Then she described an evening 7 years earlier, when the same man had stood in the doorway of her room and spoken 1 sentence about a son imprisoned in Joliet. She wrote her son's name. She wrote his case number. She wrote that he had 5 years remaining on his sentence, and that she fully understood that what she was writing would be read by people with the power to decide whether those 5 years became longer or shorter, and that she was writing it anyway. She signed her name. She folded the paper, placed it inside an envelope, sealed it, took a stamp from the drawer, and fixed it to the upper right corner. She addressed it to the Illinois State Penitentiary in Joliet for inmate Ellis Brees, and she placed the letter in the middle of the table, propped against the salt jar where anyone entering the room would see it. Then she rose. She removed her apron. She hung it on the hook behind the door. She smoothed both sides of her dress. At 4:45, the dark blue-green car stopped at the eastern entrance, hidden behind the carriage house, and no one rang the bell. Cordelia Brees climbed 2 flights of stairs. She went slowly, one hand on the banister, and paused on the landing beneath the brass lamp to catch her breath. Then she continued. She stood before August Kessler's bedroom door with her back against the wood, both hands hanging at her sides, and she held herself straight in the way a woman stands when she has no fear left. Preston Kessler Hale reached the final stair and stopped when he saw her. For 3 seconds neither of them moved. He smiled. He said, "Mrs. Bryce, go back downstairs." "It's cold up here." Cordelia Bryce didn't move. "I stood aside for 20 years, Mr. Hale," she said. "If you want to pass, then pass." He went through her. Down in the kitchen, Meredith Lane was washing her hands. She had finished weighing 3 batches of chrysanthemums and had gone upstairs for boiling water, and she turned on the faucet and washed her hands twice, thoroughly, all the way to her wrists, exactly as her father had taught her to wash them before every shift. Water flowed between her fingers. Beyond the kitchen window, the November sky was gray, the lake was flat, and there was no wind. A sound came from the floor above. It was brief. It was no louder than a heavy door closing, no louder than a stack of plates falling onto carpet. It traveled through the kitchen ceiling once, and then vanished completely, and the silence that followed was thicker than anything Meredith had ever heard. She raised her head. She stood motionless before the sink, both hands still covered in soap, and stared at the ceiling. The water continued running. It passed between her fingers and down the drain and made exactly the sound it made every morning. Then she ran. She ran through the kitchen corridor, through the wooden door, up the back staircase, 2 steps at a time, 2 steps at a time, her wet hand sliding on the polished banister, and she heard her own feet striking the carpet and nothing else. She reached the landing. She reached the 3rd floor. The corridor was empty. The wall lamp was burning, and August Kessler's bedroom door opened. It opened from within, slowly, and stopped at the width of a handspan, then opened farther, and Cordelia Bryce was sitting on the floor with her back against the doorframe, both legs stretched straight before her like a child, sitting in the grass. Her head had fallen to one side. Meredith dropped to her knees. Cordelia couldn't speak at first. She breathed, and each breath took a long time to arrive. Her right hand was clenched tightly. Meredith reached out with both hands and opened those fingers one by one, and in Cordelia Bryce's palm was the brass key as long as a hand, the key to the room beneath the east wing staircase, the key she had carried in her apron pocket for 12 years, and had given away on a September morning. Meredith took it. Cordelia opened her eyes. She looked up at the ceiling, not at Meredith, and she spoke in a voice that was very calm, almost surprised, like someone who had finally solved a problem she had been getting wrong for 20 years. I stayed silent for 20 years because of one son. It turns out I killed another. Warehouse number 9 stood at the far end of dock number 7. A concrete structure 70 yards long with a corrugated metal roof and 12 high-intensity lamps hanging from the rafters. And at 8 o'clock on the evening of the 55th day, the southern rolling door rose and the black 1967 Cadillac drove inside. August Kessler stepped out. He wore his gray coat buttoned, and he carried nothing in his hands except a thin leather case. His 7 men stood in a line along the western wall, 3 yards apart, their hands held before their waists. Harlan Voss stood at the head of the line. Lonnie Marsh stood at the end, in the center of the warehouse, between 2 rows of cargo crates stacked as high as a man's head. Preston Kessler Hale stood beside a pile of wooden boxes with 12 men behind him. He wore a gray suit. He hadn't removed his coat. He watched his nephew approach, smiled, and said, "You're far too thin, August." Meredith Lane stepped out of the back seat. No one had told her to come. No one stopped her. August didn't turn to look at her even once. He walked to the stack of wooden boxes, placed the case on top, opened the clasps, and removed a small tape recorder covered in black leather, the kind with 2 reels and a round speaker. He set it on the wood. "The desk lamp in my study," he said, "the colored glass lamp. You always said it was beautiful. You told me it was the only thing in that house still intact from grandmother's time." He pressed a button. 10 months, Uncle Preston. Inside that concrete warehouse, beneath 12 high-intensity lamps, a voice began to emerge from the round speaker. It was rough with static, but it was clear. It was the voice of a man speaking on the telephone in an empty room, and it was warm and calm, and Meredith recognized it by the second word. The voice spoke about a loan secured by 30% of the shares. It spoke about an audit scheduled for the 30th of November. It told the person at the other end not to worry, that August wouldn't live until then, that everything had been arranged 2 years earlier, but that now the process had to be accelerated. Then the tape continued, and in another passage recorded on a September morning, the same voice said very softly, very naturally, almost casually, "There will be a great deal to do this morning. Take his medicine box down to the kitchen and wipe it clean for me." People so often forget the little things. Meredith stood beside the Cadillac and heard her own voice answer, "Yes, sir," and she heard her own footsteps leaving that room. The tape continued, and the voice began to read names. It named a man called Cutter, and it told the person at the other end that if Detroit needed a name handed over to them, they could use his. It named the Ostrander brothers. It said those 2 knew too much about dock number 5 and would have to be gone before spring. No one in the warehouse moved. 12 men stood behind Preston Kessler Hale, and 3 of them had just heard their own names. The tape reached its end. The empty reel continued turning with a dry clicking sound, and then August reached out and switched the machine off. No one spoke, no footsteps moved. Then the man at the far left turned and stepped out of line. The second man followed. Then the third, the fourth, the fifth. They didn't run. They didn't speak. They simply turned their backs on the man in the gray suit and walked toward the northern rolling door, all 12 of them at once, in silence, and the sound of their shoes against the concrete floor was the only sound in 70 yards of warehouse. Preston Kessler Hale stood alone beside the wooden boxes. August stepped forward and stopped before him. "You taught me to tie a fishing hook at Lake Geneva," he said. "You kept me weak for 2 years, and I allowed it because I believed it was justice. Then 10 weeks ago, you suddenly needed me dead, not weak anymore, but dead before the 30th of November. What happened 10 weeks ago, Uncle Preston?" Preston didn't answer. "And you needed someone," August said. "You didn't find her." He paused. He didn't look toward the Cadillac. "You called the Cleveland police 22 months ago," he said. 4 months later, they arrested her father. You waited 15 months for the family court in Cuyahoga County to finish the rest. Then you sat down at a table in a cafe on Detroit Avenue and placed 4 pages before her, with one clause printed smaller than every other line. You didn't find her, Uncle Preston. You made her. You made a woman with motive, opportunity, a father who died in prison because of the same thing, and a daughter you knew she would trade anything to regain. You didn't buy her to care for me. You bought her to bury me and to give the law someone to imprison in your place." Preston Kessler Hale stood perfectly still. Then he slipped one hand inside his coat. August Kessler didn't move. He didn't step back. He didn't raise a hand. The 7 men along the western wall took exactly 1 step forward, then stopped when he raised 2 fingers. "You calculated everything," he said. "You even calculated that I would do it tonight, because you know I'm capable of it. You know better than anyone that I'm capable of it, because you were the one who stood outside the door and waited for me to come back upstairs." Preston's hand stopped. "You would rather die here," August said, "than sit for 40 years in a room with a small window and hear them read your name aloud every morning." He refastened the button of his coat that had come undone. "Live, Uncle Preston. I'll pay for the finest lawyers in America, every month until you no longer need them. I want you to live for a very long time." 4 days later, in the room at the foot of the East Wing staircase, August Kessler placed 4 sheets of paper on the stone work table, their edges yellowed with age, and he stood looking at them for a moment, and Meredith recognized her own handwriting, as small as grains of sand, at the bottom of the 4th page. He picked them up. He tore them in half, then into quarters, without haste, without ceremony, like a man tearing up a bill that had been paid long ago, and he dropped the pieces into the white porcelain bowl his mother had once used for mixing herbs. Then he placed another envelope on the table. Inside were documents from a law office on LaSalle Street stating that the entire debt held in Wendell Lane's name had been paid in full, without repayment and without conditions, and that a sum of money in Meredith Lane's name had been transferred into an account only she had the authority to sign for. There wasn't a single line about marriage. There wasn't a single line about staying. She picked up the document and read it, and she read it 3 times, just as she had read another provision in a cafe on Detroit Avenue. "This belongs to you," he said, "whether you stay or leave tonight." He looked down at his hands resting on the stone work table, "so that no one in this house can ever use the word bought again." He said nothing more. He walked out and closed the door behind him, leaving her alone with the white porcelain bowl filled with the torn remains of 4 pages. On the table, beside the brass scale, he had left a roll of stamps. Meredith Lane sat down on the wooden stool. She took the tin box from the drawer and arranged the 62 envelopes in one long row across the work table, and she began placing stamps on them, one by one, starting with the oldest. Then she took a blank sheet of paper and wrote the 63rd letter. She didn't explain the first 3 weeks. She didn't mention the 48 cents, the bus, or those 3 Sunday afternoons. She kept it very brief. She wrote that lately her mother had been working in a room filled with drawers, and every drawer had a name. She wrote that there was an 11-year-old boy who often misread those names and laughed very loudly. She wrote that grandfather had taught her something when she was her daughter's age, and only now had she finally understood why he had taught it to her. Then she wrote the final line, and she wrote it slowly. "I have learned how to smell the things that don't belong where they have been placed. Someday I'll teach you." The next morning, she carried all 63 letters to the city post office and dropped them into the mailbox, one by one, over the course of 4 minutes. There was no miracle. The Cuyahoga County Family Court didn't care who had been right and who had been wrong inside a warehouse on the southern docks of Chicago. The court required only 18 months of stable residence, 3 home inspections, an address, a source of income, and the signature of a child welfare officer who had visited the home 3 times without prior notice. August Kessler knew 3 people who could have reduced those 18 months to 6. He didn't call any of them. He didn't call because he couldn't, and he couldn't because Meredith Lane had stood in the still room one December evening and told him that if he laid so much as one finger on that case file, she would leave the house that very night, and she wouldn't return, and he had looked at her for a long time before nodding once. He only drove 400 miles there and back, every Sunday, 350 miles of highway, running along the southern shore of Lake Erie. Leaving at 4 o'clock in the morning and returning through the iron gates of Ashgrove Hill at 11 o'clock at night. He drove himself. He wouldn't allow Voss to accompany him. There were 78 Sundays during those 18 months, and he made the journey 78 times, including the Sunday in February when the snow rose as high as the axles and the return trip took him 11 hours. He parked in the lot outside the child welfare office on Payne Street. He turned off the engine. He remained inside the car. He never went in with her. On the 4th visit, standing beside the car door with a cloth bag in her hand, Meredith turned back and asked why he wouldn't come inside. August Kessler looked over the steering wheel toward the double glass doors of the 4-story red brick building, and he answered in the calm voice he always used when asking the time. Because she doesn't know who I am yet, and I don't want the first day she sees her mother again to be divided with anyone. The first visit took place on a Sunday near the end of November. 40 minutes, in a second-floor room with green carpet, a shelf of toys, and 2 windows overlooking the parking lot. The supervisor was a middle-aged woman named Hollis, who sat in a chair in the corner with a notebook on her lap and a pen in her hand, and she said, "Please make yourself comfortable, Miss Lane." Meredith Lane sat down on the green carpet. The door opened. The child didn't run toward her. She stood in the doorway, 5 years and 4 months old, her hair tied into 2 pigtails, one hand gripping the hem of her sweater, and she looked at the woman sitting on the carpet. She looked for a long time. She looked so long that Mrs. Hollis stopped writing. Meredith said nothing. She didn't hold out her arms. She remained still on that carpet and allowed the child to look at her for as long as she needed. Because during those 15 months, Meredith had learned that there were some things that mustn't be hurried. Then Ruthie Lane released the hem of her sweater. She took one step into the room, and she said, "Did you bring the letters?" On the final Friday of June, 2 years later, the garden gate at Ashgrove Hill stood open from 9 o'clock in the morning until 1 o'clock in the afternoon, 2 days each week, and whoever arrived first was seen first. Outside the entrance, a long bench stood against the stone wall, and seated upon it that morning were a dock worker from dock number 7, with an infected thumb, an 82-year-old woman who needed her blood pressure checked, 2 welders, and at the end of the line, the wife of an Illinois state legislator, who had been waiting for 40 minutes and had looked at her watch 3 times. No one allowed her to go ahead. Meredith Lane sat recording names at the reception table beside the garden entrance, and that table was made from a 4.5-yard length of walnut that the Kessler family had brought from Germany 3 generations earlier, and on its surface, about a handspan from the edge, was a cut 3 centimeters deep. No one repaired it. She rode across it twice every week. Outside on the sunlit porch, a 13-year-old boy named Jonah Prue sat on the steps with a stack of paper labels and a 7-year-old girl whose hair was tied into 2 pigtails, and he was teaching her to read. He pronounced plantain as plant head. He pronounced chrysanthemum as chicken anthem. The little girl laughed so hard that she fell backward, bracing both hands against the step, because she knew Jonah was reading the words incorrectly, and she had known for 3 months. Mr. Prue stood watering the rosebed 10 paces away, and he was laughing too. Inside the room, on the wooden shelf above the work table, between the drawer of dried chrysanthemums and the leather-bound notebook of a dead bartender, the silver knife engraved with the letter K still rested in its place. The blade was still dented. No one had ever sharpened it again. The silversmith in Harnley had written twice and then stopped. From time to time, someone waiting to be examined noticed it and asked about it, and Meredith only said that it was the most useful object in the house, because it had taught her husband to leave things that appeared broken exactly as they were, until he understood why they had stopped working. Ellis Bryce was released from Joliet 2 years early. His mother's statement was read aloud in court on a March morning. From beginning to end, without a single word omitted, and the woman who had written it wasn't there to hear it. Dr. Wesley Thorne was convicted in Cook County, and during his trial, every line from a bundle of white paper was read aloud, recording dates, times, and a pulse count every hour for 72 hours, and the judge remarked that in 19 years on the bench, she had never seen a record kept with such precision. Preston Kessler Hale was serving a 30-year sentence in an Illinois state prison. He had the finest lawyer in America, and the attorney's fee was transferred on the 5th day of every month without a single missed payment, all of it paid by August Kessler. August had gained 29 pounds. His skin was sun-browned all the way to the back of his neck. That morning he had argued loudly with Mr. Prue about the drip irrigation system in the 4th garden bed, and he had lost, and he had remained cheerfully pleased about losing for 2 full hours. At 1 o'clock, Meredith closed the garden gate. She wiped the table. She finished recording the morning's cases in the ledger: 4 fevers, 1 infected finger opened and bandaged, 1 blood pressure case remaining stable on the same dosage. She capped her pen. He stood in the garden doorway, with his coat draped over one shoulder, carrying the scent of damp earth and sunlight, and he had been standing there for some time, watching her write in that open and unhurried way of his, as though the entire afternoon had been arranged around the act of looking at her. Outside on the porch, the 2 children were still arguing over the word chrysanthemum. He held out his hand, palm upward, still asking, as he would continue to ask for the rest of his life, because it was the asking itself that was love. May I? This story leaves behind one very simple truth. No one in this world has the right to decide whether another person deserves to live, even when the person making that decision is deciding for himself. August Kessler had believed he deserved to die, and a woman refused to accept the sentence he had passed upon himself. Meredith Lane had believed she carried her father's guilt, and a man refused to accept that judgment, and Cordelia Bryce had remained silent for 20 years out of love for one son, only to learn, too late, that silence born from love is still silence. Sometimes the kindest thing we can do for someone isn't to protect them from the truth, but to speak that truth and remain beside them after it has been spoken. If Meredith's story touched something in your heart, please leave a like, share it with someone you believe needs to hear it, and subscribe to our channel for more compelling stories every day. How did this story make you feel, and did any of its characters remind you of someone in your own life? Please leave a comment because we truly want to hear what lies deep within your heart. May everyone watching this video always enjoy good health, a joyful life, and peace each day. Goodbye for now, and we'll see you again in the next video.